The telegram arrived in the late afternoon when the light in the long windows of Glamis had turned the color of weak tea. A footman carried the envelope as if it might bite him. He gave it to the Countess with both hands like an offering. The Countess read it once, then again, and the room went still. In that way, a great house can go still, as if every clock has decided it should not be the one to tick next. Elizabeth was 15, and she was not the eldest, not the youngest, not the one anyone expected to steady the room. Yet she watched her mother's face change, and she understood something before a word was spoken. In big families, grief arrives like weather. You learn to smell it. Her brother Fergus was dead in France. Someone began to cry, then tried to stop, which only made it worse. A maid took a step toward the counters and stopped again, caught between duty and fear. In a house like this, there were rules for everything, even sorrow. Close the curtains, send for the chaplain. Do not let the younger ones run wild. Do not let the staff see you fall apart. Elizabeth did not raise her voice. She did not rush to the center of the room to claim attention. She simply moved, quietly, with the confidence of someone who had learned early that feelings could be managed if not defeated. She took the teacup her sister had been holding so hard it trembled. She set it down. She reached for a bell and rang it once. When the footman returned, she told him to find her father, the Earl of Strathmore. She told him to ask the cook to keep supper warm. She told him very calmly to bring more tea. The words were ordinary, almost ridiculous in their smallness. Tea when her son had died. Supper when a family had just been torn open. Yet the room listened because the room needed something to do. Later, people would say Elizabeth had been strong. Others would say she had been cold. Some would say she had a gift for making the unbearable look proper, which is a compliment in a palace and an insult in a memoir. She would spend a lifetime being described in opposite ways by people who had seen the same smile and decided it meant whatever they needed it to mean. She had been born into that smile. Elizabeth Bose's Lion came into the world in August 1900 in London, in a townhouse that belonged to people who could afford London without needing it to impress anyone. Her father, Claude Bose-Lyon, was an earl, which meant his name opened doors even when his bank account did not always keep up with the size of those doors. Her mother, Cecilia, had the kind of family tree that came with its own assumptions. The Cavendish Bentings carried a quiet certainty that they belonged near power, whether or not power asked for them. Elizabeth was the 9th child. There were so many children that the nursery did not feel like a nursery. It felt like a small country with its own alliances and rebellions. In photographs, the older siblings stand with the air of people already training for adulthood. The younger ones look as if they are waiting to be told whether they are loved or merely included. Elizabeth sits in the middle range, the age where you are old enough to notice everything and young enough to be ignored when you choose. The family lived between two worlds. There was St. Paul's Waldenbury in Hertfordshire, an English estate that spoke of order, hedges clipped, lawns rolled, routines kept. And there was Glamis Castle in Scotland, larger, darker, full of stories that made good behavior feel like a suggestion rather than a rule. Glamis had towers and stone and corridors that could swallow your footsteps. Children in such houses learn early that a grand place is not the same as a comfortable place. It can be cold in a castle. It can also be crowded. Wealth does not guarantee warmth. It guarantees expectations. The Bose-Lyon money was old, tied to land and coal and the long habits of ownership. But old money comes with old problems. Estates were expensive to run. Staff had to be paid. Roofs had to be repaired. The world beyond the gates was changing. People spoke more loudly about fairness. Newspapers grew bolder. Parliament grew interested in the fortunes of people who owned too much. Families like the Bose-Lyons began to realize that the old trick of simply existing was no longer enough. You had to manage. You had to appear. You had to keep your dignity, even when you were quietly selling something to pay for the next season. Elizabeth grew up watching her parents perform that management. Her father was kind in the way that can be disarming. He liked comfort, conversation, the pleasures of home, and he did not treat his children like decorations. Yet he was also a man of his time, a landed aristocrat whose word was expected to settle at arguments. Her mother was brisker. Cecilia could be charming, certainly. She could also be exacting. She understood the social world like a language. She knew how to place a person in a room, how to make a guest feel chosen, how to make a rival feel overlooked without ever saying a cruel word aloud. Elizabeth watched her mother and learned a lesson that would shape her entire life. You do not have to be loud to win. You only have to be certain, and you only have to understand what the other person wants. As a girl, she was educated at home. There were governesses, lessons, French, music, the kind of learning designed to make a young woman pleasant and competent without making her dangerous. But a big house is an education of its own. She learned how people spoke, differently to her father than to a servant. She learned how a compliment could land like a slap depending on who delivered it. She learned that men talked politics at dinner, as if the country were a chessboard, while women adjusted the atmosphere, which was a different kind of power, easier to deny and harder to measure. She also learned the performance of cheerfulness. In a family with 10 children, your sadness could be inconvenient. Your anger could be ignored, but a bright laugh, a clever remark, a face that looked pleased to see you, those were rewarded. Elizabeth developed a way of making people feel in the first few minutes that she liked them. Many people never looked beyond that first impression. Then the war came. In 1914, a great conflict that would later be called the First World War began to pull the young men of Britain away like a tide. At first there was excitement, the kind that comes when people believe hardship will last a few months and end with parades. Then there were lists. Then there were telegrams. The Bowes-Lyon boys went. Like most families of their class, they felt duty and pride and fear all tangled together. Elizabeth watched uniforms appear in the hall, watched her mother press a aisle into place, watched her father stand a little straighter, as if posture could protect his sons. Glamis became part of the war effort in the way many great houses did. Rooms that had once held house parties and flirting, and midnight laughter now held the wounded. Beds were lined up, floors were scrubbed. The smell of disinfectant replaced the smell of coal fires and polished wood. Nurses moved through halls that had once belonged to servants carrying trays. Elizabeth, still a teenager, did what so many women did then. She worked. She helped in the makeshift hospital. She poured tea, carried small comforts, learned how to look at pain without showing pity that might humiliate a man who had given a limb for a country that would still call him ordinary. The war taught her that people remember how you make them feel when they are at their weakest. She never forgot. When Fergus died in 1915, it was not only the loss of a brother, it was the loss of a certain innocence about how the world worked. War did not care that his mother was a countess. It did not care that his sisters were pretty. It did not care that the family had hosted important guests and had portraits on the walls. Death treated them like everyone else, except that the family had to grieve politely. Elizabeth did grieve. She was not made of stone, but she learned to keep her grief behind her teeth. A private thing, something you controlled. People who cannot be controlled are often punished, especially women. By the time the war ended, Britain was not the same place. There were fewer servants willing to serve. There were more voices demanding change. There were men returning to villages and cities, altered, restless. There were women who had done work that mattered and were being told to go back to being decorative. There were fortunes strained by the cost of living and the cost of keeping up. The social season in London restarted anyway, because it always restarted. High society is like a clock. Even when the house is on fire, someone will ask whether it is time for tea. Elizabeth was in her late teens when she began to appear more often. In the world that mattered for a young woman of her rank, she was pretty, yes, but so were many. What people remembered was her manner. She could be warm without seeming needy. She could be amused without seeming foolish. She had a face that suggested she was listening, even when she had already decided what she thought. She also had a very clear sense of what she did not want. Many young women of her class were raised to catch a good marriage the way a family catches a good investment. The language was polite, but the logic was plain. A husband meant stability, a title meant safety, money meant you could keep the estate, or at least keep the illusion of the estate. But Elizabeth had watched the way money could slip away under the weight of buildings and obligations. She had watched the way a marriage could be a trap dressed up as a rescue. She did not want to be rescued. She wanted to choose. That choice would become the most argued over part of her early life, because later people would insist she must have schemed. They would look at the crown she eventually wore and work backward, as if all roads lead only one way. Others would insist she was simply a young woman who happened to love a shy prince and was swept into the history. The truth was more complicated, and complication is what people least enjoy about famous women. Elizabeth enjoyed complication. She just preferred it well managed. In the years after the war, house parties returned. The country houses filled again with guests who laughed a little too loudly, perhaps because laughter sounded like proof they had survived. Men flirted as if the world had not ended. Women measured one another with that careful curiosity that pretends to be friendship. Elizabeth moved through that world with ease. She could ride, she could shoot, she could hold her own in conversation. She also understood when to stop talking and let someone else feel clever. That is a skill, and like most skills, it can be used kindly or not. If you asked her friends, they would tell you she was loyal, funny, protective. If you asked some of the people who crossed her later, they would tell you she could be ruthless, that she remembered slights the way other people remember birthdays. One could be true without canceling the other. The family itself was an education in politics. With so many siblings, there were always shifting alliances. Someone was always engaged or heartbroken or in debt or hiding a secret they thought the others did not notice. Elizabeth learned to observe. She learned to hold a confidence. She learned that secrets are currency, but spending them is dangerous. Better to let people know you could spend them. In 1920, the royal family was still wrapped in the stiff formality of King George V and Queen Mary, a couple who believed duty was a kind of religion. Their children grew up under pressure, each one a symbol before they were fully a person. The eldest, Edward W., as glamorous, restless, adored. The second, son, Albert, was quieter, dutiful, anxious, often uncomfortable in his own skin. He struggled with a stammer. He hated public speaking. He felt the weight of expectation without the ease of confidence that sometimes carries people through it. When Elizabeth first encountered Prince Albert, Duke of York, the details of the exact moment mattered less than the atmosphere around it. It was not a sweeping romance in a garden with violins. It was the kind of meeting that happens in the British upper world through family connections, at events where everyone pretends the meeting is accidental, though it has been arranged by a dozen hands. He noticed her. That part is not in doubt. Elizabeth had the kind of presence that filled a room without taking it over. She was lively yet contained. She made other people feel slightly safer around her, as if she knew the rules and could guide you through them. Albert, for all his rank, did not feel safe in rooms. He felt examined. He felt judged. In her, he sensed something familiar, not weakness, but an understanding of how it felt to be watched. For Elizabeth, he was intriguing, but intrigue is not the same as desire. She was not a girl who fainted at titles. She had plenty of titles in her own family, and she had seen what those titles could not protect you from. She also knew that marrying into the royal family meant living inside a system that never truly belonged to you. You would be praised for smiles you did not feel. You would be blamed for problems you did not create. Your children would be public property. It would take a certain kind of woman to accept that bargain. A sweet one might accept and be broken. A stubborn one might accept and try to change it. Elizabeth was stubborn with a charm that made her stubbornness harder to call by its name. Albert began to pursue her in the way men of his rank pursued women then, with an awkward sincerity. Invitations, letters, appearances that looked casual and were anything but. He was not a rake. He did not know how to play games. That was in its own way disarming. Elizabeth did not make it easy for him. Some later accounts would frame her refusals as cruelty, others would frame them as wisdom. A young woman with 10 siblings watching the world shift under her feet might simply have wanted to be sure. She had seen what duty could do to a person. She had watched her mother carry burdens like a handbag, never setting them down. She had watched men of good families stumble into marriages that looked perfect from outside and felt like prisons inside. She did not want a prison, even one with gold doorknobs. At the same time, she was not blind to what Albert offered beyond rank. There was a decency in him, a steadiness. He wanted a home, not an audience. He wanted affection, not conquest. He wanted someone who would be on his side in a family where siblings were affectionately competitive and always under the shadow of their parents. Elizabeth knew what it was to live in a large family. She knew what it was to carve out a space in a crowd. She understood the small humiliations and the private jokes, the way love could be, loud one day and silent the next. She knew how to make a home feel like a shelter even when it was filled with people. That more than diamonds was what Albert needed. In the early 1920s, Britain was recovering, but recovery is not the same as peace. Strikes and unemployment and political anger were never far from the surface. The upper classes, sensing the ground shifting, clung tighter to tradition. Etiquette became even more important because etiquette was one of the few ways they knew to pretend everything was stable. Elizabeth moved through this world like someone who could see the lines, holding it together, and knew exactly where to press. At a dinner, she could choose a topic that kept 2 rivals from sparring. At a garden party, she could speak warmly to someone ignored by others, and the ignored person would remember it for decades. At a hunting weekend, she could tease a pompous man without humiliating him, which meant he would leave thinking he had been entertained rather than corrected. She had learned the art of control disguised as kindness. Some people adored her for it. Some resented her because control is easier to forgive when it comes in the shape of a man. Money hovered in the background of all these gatherings. People did not talk about it directly, but it shaped every choice. Families that had once employed dozens now employed fewer. Old jewels appeared less often. Some houses were closed for parts of the year to save coal. Marriages were still negotiated quietly, between affection and necessity. A young woman could be romantic, but her family needed her to be practical. Elizabeth was practical in a way that did not look like practicality. She did not behave as if she were hunting. She behaved as if she were choosing. When Albert proposed the first time, she said no. That no was not theatrical. It was not meant to wound. It was a boundary. She knew that if she said yes too quickly, people would assume she wanted the crown more than the man, even though Albert was not expected to inherit it. She also knew that once she stepped into that world, she could not step out again. A woman could break an engagement. A woman could not break a royal marriage without the world treating her like a cautionary tale. Albert did not lash out. He did not punish her with gossip. He kept trying, awkwardly, earnestly, like someone who had finally found a person who made the future feel bearable and could not accept being told the future was closed. Elizabeth watched him. She tested him without looking like she was testing him. She listened to what he said about his family. She noticed how he treated servants. She noticed whether he could laugh at himself. She noticed whether he insisted on getting his way. He did not insist. He asked that mattered. Her mother, Cecilia, likely had her own thoughts. A match with a royal prince was a glittering thing, no matter what you told yourself about duty and sacrifice. Yet Cecilia was not foolish. She would have known the royal family was not an easy one, and that a daughter who married into it would be swallowed by it, unless she had a spine made of iron. Cecilia had raised daughters. She knew what she had made. The Earl of Strathmore, gentle and affectionate, may have worried about his bride-daughter disappearing into a world of rules even tighter than his own. But fathers in that world often surrendered such worries to tradition. The match was honorable, The prince was decent. The rest was out of their hands. Elizabeth herself carried an internal argument that she never had to speak aloud. She could stay in her own world, marry a nobleman, run a house, host friends, manage estates, live with a comfortable distance from the center of power, or she could step into the furnace of the royal family where everything we would be judged, everything recorded, everything interpreted. She would lose privacy, she would gain influence, she would be in a position to protect people she loved if she was strong enough to survive. Strength, she already understood, was not always pretty. In those days, people liked to imagine that women were made of softness. It suited men to believe it, and sometimes it suited women to pretend. Elizabeth could be soft, certainly. She could be affectionate. She could be tender with children, attentive to the wounded, gentle with the shy. But she also had something else, a readiness to hold her ground, that unsettled certain people. A woman who smiles while refusing to be moved can inspire devotion or hatred, often both. It is tempting to label that as nastiness, because nastiness is a word that makes a woman easier to dismiss. It turns strategy into temperament. It turns a clear memory into spite. It turns refusal into cruelty. The people who called Elizabeth sharp were often the people she did not let steer her, and she did not let many people steer her. One evening, at a gathering where the air smelled of flowers and cigar smoke and the careful comfort of money, Albert found himself beside her again. He had been speaking with someone important, someone whose approval mattered in the way approval always matters around royalty. Elizabeth had been speaking with someone less important, someone who looked surprised to be spoken to at all. When she turned, her eyes met Albert's, and for a moment his face did what it so rarely did in public. It relaxed. She saw it. She filed it away. They talked, as people do in that world, about ordinary things that were not ordinary at all. Weather, which meant travel plans, horses, which meant status, friends, which meant alliances. A casual remark about a cousin could reveal a family rift. A joke could be a test to see whether the other person understood the same rules. Elizabeth understood the rules better than most. Albert understood them too, but he hated them. As the conversation went on, he grew quieter, then braver, as if the act of being near her allowed him to borrow her steadiness. He spoke about Scotland, about Balmoral, about the relief of being away from London. Elizabeth spoke about Glamis, and the way the stone held the cold late into spring. She made a small joke about how a castle could feel like a draught with furniture. Albert laughed, then stopped himself as if laughter might be inappropriate. She smiled at him as if to say it was allowed. In that smile was a promise and a warning, though neither of them would have called it that at the time. She could make a hard life feelable. She could also be very hard on anyone who tried to take away the life she had chosen. Albert looked at her, then down at his hands, then back at her, as if he were rehearsing courage in his mind. His voice, when it came, was careful, as if he were stepping onto ice. He said he hoped he might see her again soon, and he did not say it like a line. He said it like a request. Elizabeth did not answer him with a flirtation. She answered him with consideration, which was rarer, and to him far more intoxicating. She told him simply that she expected they would because their circles made it likely, and because she added with a gentle firmness that made him look up quickly. She did not care for people who appeared once and then vanished, as if it had all been a mistake. It was a small statement. It sounded almost polite, but it was also a rule. Albert nodded as if he had just been given instructions for survival, and he said very quietly that he would not vanish. And as the evening moved on, and the room filled with other voices, he stayed close enough to her to feel for the first time in a long while that the future might be something he could walk into without trembling, even if it required him to ask again and again until she finally decided what sort of man deserved a yes from Elizabeth Bose's lion, and what sort of woman she would have to become if she gave it to him. Albert did not vanish. In the days that Followed, he appeared with the regularity of a man who had finally found a lamp in a long hallway and decided he was going to walk toward it, no matter who laughed at him for needing the light. He wrote letters that were careful, almost formal, as if he did not trust his own feelings not to spill ink all over the page. When he spoke to her in person, he was quieter, even when the room was noisy. It was his way of keeping the moment safe. Elizabeth read him quickly. She saw the stiffness that came over him in groups, the way his shoulders rose as if the room were colder than it was, the way his voice sometimes caught and had to be pushed forward with sheer will. People who enjoyed watching others struggle treated that as entertainment. Elizabeth treated it as information. She also treated it as a warning. There were men who wanted a wife like a medal. There were men who wanted a wife like a mother. Albert did not seem to want either. He wanted a partner. It was an appealing idea, but appealing ideas still come with consequences, and the consequence here wore a crown, even if it was not meant for him. She saw him again at another gathering, then another. She saw him in London, drawing rooms and in country house corridors where conversations traveled like smoke. Everywhere they went, other people watched, because that is what society does when it senses a story forming. A prince, shy and beautiful, pursuing a young woman who was neither desperate nor dazzled. It was the sort of plot that made older women smile and made younger women take notes. Some of the smiles were affectionate, some were sharp. When Elizabeth returned to her family, the house seemed louder than London. 10 children had a way of making even grief feel crowded. Her mother watched her with the calm look of a woman who preferred to know everything without ever asking directly. Her father, gentler, looked almost hopeful, then scolded himself for it with a joke, as if joking could keep his daughter from being carried away by history. The first time Albert asked her, plainly, without witnesses, without the safety of a crowded room, Elizabeth felt the air change. It happened in a sitting room that smelled faintly of polished wood and coal smoke. There was a fire, because there was always a fire when people had money for it. Albert stood too close to the mantel, as if he needed something solid at his back. He spoke her name with care. He said he loved her. He said he wanted her to marry him. Elizabeth looked at him a moment longer than was comfortable. She let silence do some of the work for her. Silence makes people reveal themselves. Albert did not rush to fill it. He waited like a man who had learned waiting was the only way to keep from stumbling. She did not pretend to be flattered and helpless. She did not reach for drama. She told him the truth. That mattered. The truth that would not let her sleep if she hid it. She said she could not marry him. The words hit the room like a dropped dish, not loud, but unmistakable. Albert's face tightened. He did not ask why in a demanding way. He asked why as if he needed to know whether he should hate himself or the world. Elizabeth's answer was careful. She did not say, "I do not love you," even if she was not sure yet whether love was what she felt. She said she could not face the life. She said she valued her family, her privacy, her freedom to walk into a room without the room belonging to her. She said she had seen what duty could do, how it could turn people into symbols. She did not want to be a symbol. Albert swallowed hard the way he did when he was fighting his own voice. He said very quietly that he understood, then he failed at hiding how badly he was hurt. Elizabeth watched him leave, and it would have been easy if she were a simpler person to feel only triumph at keeping control. But she felt something else, too, a faint unease. Not guilt exactly, more like the sensation of having turned away from a door and realizing you might have locked it behind you. Her mother did not ask for details. Cecilia had the kind of restraint that could feel like kindness or like a trap. Instead, she offered her order tea, as if tea could solve anything. Elizabeth took it because tea at least gave you something to do with your hands. In London, the royal family learned what had happened in the way royal families learn everything, through murmurs. Queen Mary was not a woman who enjoyed being surprised. She ran her household like a ship and expected the world to respect the ship's schedule. A refusal was not a personal insult exactly, but it was an inconvenience, and inconveniences required management. King George V, solid and stubborn, would have seen the matter more bluntly. A prince had proposed, a young woman had refused. Either she did not understand what she was being offered, or she did not have the right instincts, or she had a will that might become troublesome. In a different family, will could be admired. In the royal family, will was useful only when it served the institution. Albert's elder brother, Edward, the Prince of Wales, had a different sort of reaction. Edward had charm the way some people have height. He could not help having it, and he enjoyed it. He moved through crowds as if the crowds existed for him. People adored him, which meant he was always at risk of believing adoration was the same thing as loyalty. He took an interest in everything that glittered, including the story of his brother being turned down. It amused him, and amusement was one of Edward's favorite feelings. When Edward encountered Elizabeth afterward, he was teasing as if they shared a joke. He spoke with warmth, but there was a faint edge, the edge of a man who had never truly been told no, and wanted to test the taste of it. He said something about his brother being terribly devoted. Elizabeth smiled and said devotion was a fine thing, so long as one did not confuse it with entitlement. Edward laughed, then looked at her more closely. He liked women who pushed back, and he liked the game of it. What he did not always like was that the women who pushed back tended to see him clearly. Elizabeth saw him clearly. She also knew Edward would one day be king unless the world turned upside down. A woman who planned to stay safely in her own aristocratic sphere might have reason to flatter him. Elizabeth did not flatter. She was polite, she was charming, and she was unmoved. This was, in its own quiet way, daring. Albert did not give up. He tried to behave as if he accepted her decision because he believed that was honorable. But his face betrayed him. He looked older. He looked as if he had returned to the life he dreaded. He still had duties, still had appearances, still had the constant weight of being observed. Without Elizabeth, he seemed more alone inside that observation. She noticed this. She told herself she was not responsible for it. She told herself she had been honest. She told herself she had done the right thing by refusing a life she did not want. And then the world did what it often does when people make decisions, based on fear. It kept putting the same question back in front of them, until the fear looked less like caution and more like surrender. At another weekend gathering, the kind with shooting parties and long meals and voices that grew louder with each glass, Elizabeth watched Albert in a room full of confident men. Someone made a joke at his expense, not cruel enough to be condemned, but cruel enough to land. Albert smiled tightly. The room moved on. Elizabeth felt heat rise in her chest, not because she needed to defend a prince, but because she despised cowardly cruelty, and she despised it most when it was disguised as humor. She found herself speaking to Albert later in a quieter corner, not with flirtation, but with a simple statement that landed like a hand placed firmly on a table. She told him she had heard the joke. She told him it was vulgar. She told him some men could only feel tall by standing on someone else's shoes. Albert's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, more like relief. He thanked her. Then he looked down and admitted in a voice that was small and honest that he hated rooms like that. He hated feeling like a schoolboy again. Elizabeth did not soothe him with empty reassurance. She did not say, "Do not mind them," because people who are mocked cannot simply decide not to feel it. Instead, she said, "They are afraid of you." He looked startled. She said, "Not afraid of your title, afraid of what you represent, duty, steadiness, the ability to endure. People who cannot endure like to pretend is dull. Dull is a word they use when they are jealous." Albert stared at her as if she had spoken a language no one else used with him. He asked softly if she truly believed that. Elizabeth shrugged in a way that suggested she did not waste time on beliefs, only on observations. Then she did something that would become a pattern. She changed the subject gently, as if she had given him a gift and did not want him to feel he owed her gratitude for it. When he proposed, again, Elizabeth did not react with shock. She reacted with irritation, not At him, exactly. At the situation. At the way the question kept returning, like a bill that someone refused to pay. She told him firmly that he must not ask her again. Albert's face went white. He asked if she meant forever. Elizabeth hesitated. It was not a romantic hesitation. It was the pause of a woman calculating the weight of a choice that could not be made light. She told him she could not give him an answer that would satisfy everyone. She could only give him the honest answer she had. She said she did not want to be part of that life, and she was frightened of what it would require of her. She did not apologize for being frightened. She simply admitted it. Albert listened. Then he did something that in its own way was his best argument. He did not try to talk her out of her fear. He asked what he could do to make it less. Elizabeth looked at him and understood that he was not trying to win a prize. He was trying to build a home. She had grown up in grand houses, but she knew the difference between a house and a home. A house was stone and servants and tradition. A home was a place where you could breathe without asking permission. Albert wanted that. The tragedy was that he wanted it inside the one family in Britain where breathing without permission was considered a bad habit. Elizabeth began to imagine what it might mean to join him, not as a submissive bride being escorted into a gilded cage, but as a woman walking in with her head up, prepared to rearrange the furniture. This was where the rumors began to sharpen. Some people later claimed Elizabeth loved the chase, that she enjoyed keeping a prince dangling. Others claimed she wanted him only after she saw the power it could bring. Neither version gives her credit for being human. The simplest truth is often the least dramatic, and so it rarely survives. She hesitated because she was intelligent. She hesitated because she could see the trap, and she hesitated because beneath her caution something in Albert moved her more deeply than she expected. He was not exciting in the way Edward was exciting. He was not reckless. He was not the man who would sweep you into a dance and make you feel chosen in front of everyone. Albert would choose you in private and then choose you again the next day and again, even when nobody was watching. For a woman who had seen loyalty in wartime and grief in her mother's face, that kind of devotion could look less like romance and more like safety. Safety has its own seduction. When she finally said yes, it did not happen with a crowd applauding. It happened in the quiet way many life-changing moments happen. A conversation, a decision, a look that lingered long enough for both people to understand it had changed. The engagement was announced, and suddenly Elizabeth was no longer simply a charming daughter of an earl. She was a public figure. Strangers who had never seen her in person began to have opinions about her face, her clothes, her suitability. Newspapers described her with the hungry politeness they used for royal women, half admiration, half inspection. She was praised for being fresh, for being natural, for being the kind of girl people imagined that they might know, even though most of them could not have found Glamis on a map without help. Elizabeth read the coverage with a kind of amused detachment. She knew better than to take praise seriously because praise has a way of turning into blame the moment you disappoint. She also knew that being liked by the public was valuable. It was a kind of currency. She did not have to love the attention to understand how to use it. The wedding took place at Westminster Abbey in April 1923, a setting so heavy with history it almost makes young brides look like actors in a story that began long before them. Elizabeth walked down the aisle and felt the weight of eyes on her, not just eyes in the Abbey, but eyes across the country. People wanted her to be a symbol whether she wanted it or not. A symbol of hope after war, a symbol of stability, a symbol that the royal family could still produce love stories and not only rules. She wore a simple elegance, and simplicity was its own form of strategy. In a world where jewels could scream, simplicity could whisper, and whispers often travel farther. As she approached the altar, she caught sight of Queen Mary. The Queen's face was controlled, her posture exact, her gaze steady. There was approval there, but it was the kind of approval that did not mean affection. It meant acceptance, which is what institutions offer when they cannot afford to do otherwise. King George V looked solemn, as if he were watching a duty being fulfilled rather than a romance being celebrated. Edward looked handsome and bored, as if he were attending an event that existed to interrupt his real life. Albert looked at Elizabeth with a mixture of devotion and terror, as if he could not quite believe he had been allowed to keep her. Elizabeth saw all of this in a glance, because she had always watched rooms, and now the room was the country. After the vows, after the procession, after the pew, blick cheering that sounded like the sea. When it hit stone, Elizabeth did something small that was noticed by people who knew what to look for. She left her bouquet at the tomb of the unknown warrior. It was a gesture of remembrance, a silent nod to the men who had not come home, including her brother Fergus. It was also a message. She was not going to be a royal bride floating above the pain of the nation. She was going to anchor herself in it. People were moved. The papers praised her. It was said to be spontaneous, though even if it was planned with feeling, and feeling is what the public buys. The marriage began with affection, but affection does not protect you from the machinery of a palace. Within days, Elizabeth discovered that she had not married only Albert. She had married his family, his staff, his schedules, and the thick, invisible web of people who believed they owned him. There were courtiers whose faces never quite moved when they spoke, as if emotion was something that might stain their uniforms. There were ladies who had served the royal women for decades, and regarded new arrivals the way old cats regard a new kitten, with suspicion and an assumption of superiority. There were rules about where you stood, how you addressed people, how you wrote letters, how you entered rooms. It was as if the palace believed life itself was dangerous unless it was handled with gloves. Elizabeth had grown up with rules. She was not shocked by rules. What shocked her was the pettiness of them, the endless fuss over precedents, the way a small change could produce a tremor of outrage, the way a servant could look at you as if you had committed a crime because you moved a chair without asking. Albert tried to warn her. He tried to guide her gently, but he was also a product of the same machine, trained to obey it even when it made him miserable. Elizabeth was not trained to obey misery. There was an early moment, small and ordinary, that revealed her steel. A court official suggested politely that she should not invite certain friends to a private dinner because they were not quite the right sort, as if friendship were a matter of paperwork. Elizabeth listened, smiling, then said that she would invite whom she pleased, because she had not married in order to sit alone with people who terrified her by never laughing. The official looked appalled, as if laughter were a threat to the Constitution. Elizabeth's smile did not change. Later, Albert, trying not to panic, asked her if she realized what she had done. Elizabeth answered calmly that she realized exactly what she had done. She had made it clear early that she was not going to be managed like a piece of furniture. This was the side of her that later would be called difficult or worse. The words varied depending on who was speaking. Those who served the old court thought she was too modern. Those who admired her thought she was brave. Those who wanted to control her thought she was dangerous. It is remarkable how often the same behavior earns different labels based on whether it helps the person doing the labeling. Elizabeth began to shape her new life the way she had always shaped rooms. She learned the rules quickly, then she tested which ones could bend. She understood that some traditions were sacred to the institution and could not be touched without consequences. She LSO understood that many traditions survived only because nobody had questioned them in front of the right people. She chose her own circle with care. She was not foolish enough to build a court of enemies, but she was not meek enough to surrender her personality. She kept Albert close to his family while quietly protecting him from their sharpest edges. She encouraged him, praised him, teased him just enough to make him feel normal. She did not treat his stammer as a shameful secret. She treated it as a fact, and she made it clear to anyone with manners that mocking it would be considered a personal insult to her. Albert had lived with the fear of humiliation. With Elizabeth, he began to experience something new. the idea that he might be defended, not out of duty, but out of love. Their life as the Duke and Duchess of York was busy. There were visits to factories, appearances at hospitals, endless handshakes, endless small talk with people who wanted a glimpse of royalty to brighten an ordinary week. Elizabeth learned to perform for the public without looking like she was performing. She could stand in front of a crowd and make each person feel briefly that she saw them. It was a gift, and like all gifts, it could be used as a weapon. Behind closed doors, she was less soft. She pushed Albert to face what he feared. She pushed him to practice speeches, to prepare, to stop apologizing with his posture for taking up space. She believed he deserved dignity. She also believed that dignity was not something given, it was something taken politely with both hands. They were in those first years not glamorous in the way Edward was glamorous. They were domestic, earnest, affectio. Nate. It appealed to the public. It also appealed to parts of the royal family that feared Edward's restlessness, though few would have admitted it aloud. Edward, for his part, continued to shine. He traveled, he charmed, he collected admirers. Women adored him, men wanted to be him. The newspapers treated him like a story that could sell itself. Yet beneath the charm was a hint of something unsettled, a hunger that praise did not fill. He was always chasing the next thrill, the next party, the next woman who made him feel alive. Elizabeth watched Edward the way she watched everyone, with interest, with calculation, and with a quiet sense of unease. She did not judge him for his need to escape. She judged him for the consequences of it. A prince could indulge himself. A future king could not without dragging the whole country along. The tension between the brothers was not always loud. It did not need to be. It lived in small moments. Edward arriving late to a family gathering and acting as if everyone should be grateful. He arrived at all. Albert, sitting stiffly, trying to hide irritation, while Elizabeth smiled and steered the conversation away from the sharp rocks. Queen Mary watching her eldest son with a look that contained both love and disappointment, as if she was staring at a crack in a vase she refused to throw away. Elizabeth began to understand something else, too. The royal family was not merely a family. It was a business, a brand, though nobody would have used that word aloud. It depended on stability. It depended on appearances. It depended on a public that believed the royals were both above ordinary life and somehow comforting in their nearness to it. Elizabeth was good at that illusion. Perhaps she had been trained for it since childhood in rooms where everything was a performance. Perhaps she simply enjoyed it. The truth is that she did enjoy parts of it. She liked making people happy. She liked being admired. She liked winning. And winning in this world often meant winning without anyone noticing you had fought. This was another reason some people disliked her. A woman who enjoys influence is easier to resent than a man who assumes it. There were private strains as well. Elizabeth missed her family. She missed Scotland, the particular cold of stone walls, the way Glamish belonged to her in a way palaces never would. She missed being able to retreat into ordinary intimacy. In the royal household, even private rooms could feel public because staff moved in and out, like tides. Privacy had to be negotiated, and negotiations were never truly private. She dealt with it the way she dealt with everything. She made decisions. She insisted on small comforts. She created rituals that belonged only to her and Albert, a certain chair, a certain time of day, a way of speaking to each other that did not belong to the court. These details mattered. They were how you stay married, when your marriage is constantly being used as a symbol. And there were money questions always present, always handled with discretion. The Duke of York had an allowance, but allowances are not the same as fortunes, and appearances were expensive. Clothes, staff, travel, charity obligations, all of it added up. Elizabeth had grown up watching estates strain under costs. She was not careless. She had taste, and taste can be costly, but she also had a practical streak. She understood that a well-chosen dress worn with confidence could do more than a trunk full of extravagance. She also understood the power of image. If the public saw her as warm, steady, and familiar, then she could afford to be tougher in private because the public would not want to believe anything bad about her. People protect the stories they love. Elizabeth was learning how to give them one. The palace staff began to realize she was not a temporary guest. She was not a timid girl who would be frightened into obedience. She was a woman who smiled as she rearranged the boundaries. Some staff adored her. She could be generous. She remembered names. She asked after sick relatives. She could make a servant feel like a person, and that is a gift that earns fierce loyalty. Other staff found her exhausting because she expected competence, and she expected it without excuses. She had little patience for laziness dressed up as tradition. She had even less patience for people who tried to use rules as a way to humiliate her husband. Albert began to rely on her not only emotionally but practically. If he had to face a difficult engagement, he would look to Elizabeth first, as if she carried the map. If he had to endure a lecture from his mother or a cool dismissal from a court official, he would endure it better, knowing Elizabeth would later roll her eyes at the absurdity of it and make him laugh. Laughter became one of their private rebellions, yet even as their marriage settled into partnership, the larger storm clouds remained. King George V was aging. The country was uneasy. Politics were shifting. The royal family had to appear modern enough to be relevant and traditional enough to be reassuring. Edward was popular, but popularity can be thin as paper when it is tested. Albert was dependable, but dependability is often overlooked until it is desperately needed. Elizabeth saw all of this, and quietly she began to prepare, not in a melodramatic way, not with grand declarations. She prepared in the way she always had, by learning the room, by learning the people, by storing away weaknesses, not to exploit cruelty, but to understand where pressure would land when it came. If she was going to survive this life, she would have to be more than charming. She would have to be strategic. She would have to be at times ruthless, but she would have to look kind while doing it because kindness was her armor. And then, not long after the wedding glow had dimmed, a message arrived that reminded her how little control even the most carefully managed woman truly has. It was not a telegram this time. It was a quiet conversation, a doctor's visit arranged discreetly, a closed door, a solemn face trying to look reassuring. Elizabeth understood before anyone said the words. She had always had a talent for sensing the weather. A child was expected. Albert, when he heard, went pale with a mixture of joy and fear. Joy because it was what he had wanted, a family that belonged to him. Fear because in their world even a baby was not merely a baby. A baby was a symbol. A baby was a line of succession. A baby was the future of an institution that never truly rested. Elizabeth placed a hand on his arm and smiled, but her mind was already moving. She knew what this meant. The public would watch her body as if it were a national project. The family would have opinions. The household would tighten around her like a net, and somewhere beyond the palace walls, the country would continue to change impatiently, unpredictably, while the royal family tried to persuade everyone that the old world was still holding. Elizabeth had stepped into the story. Now the story was going to write itself through her, whether she liked it or not. The next months taught Elizabeth that pregnancy inside the royal family was not a private condition. It was a public appointment. Doctors appeared with solemn faces and quiet voices. Ladies-in-waiting appeared with softer faces and louder opinions. Every meal became a discussion of what was proper, what was wise, what was traditional. Elizabeth had spent her youth surrounded by siblings and servants. She thought she knew what it meant to live without privacy. Then she discovered the palace version where people acted as if your body belonged to the country and your feelings were a charming accessory. She did not fight it openly. She did something more effective. She smiled. She listened. She thanked people for their concern. Then she did what she wanted anyway. If she wanted a walk, she took a walk. If she wanted a friend to visit, the friend visited, if a court official suggested she should rest at a particular hour, because it had always been done that way, Elizabeth asked who exactly had written the law of tiredness. The official did not know how to answer. That was the point. Albert watched her with gratitude and a little awe. He had grown up obeying rules so quickly that sometimes he did not even notice he was obeying. Elizabeth noticed. She noticed everything, then decided which things deserved her respect. When she spoke to him about it, she did it gently, as if she were describing weather. She told him the palace was full of people who confused habit with wisdom. She told him habit was useful, but it was not holy. For Albert, that was a thrilling idea, and also terrifying. It meant there were choices. Choices meant responsibility. Responsibility meant fear. He had never been short on fear. The public waited for news with the hungry patience of people who had been through war and wanted something softer to hold on to. A royal baby sounded like the future behaving itself. Newspapers printed harmless details, the sort that made readers feel included without being told anything real. Women in shops discussed whether the Duchess would have a boy. Men pretended not to care, then asked anyway. Elizabeth listened to the chatter and understood something important. People were not simply curious. They were invested. They wanted her to succeed because it made them feel the country might succeed too. That kind of goodwill can be a gift. It can also be a leash. When the time came, it was handled with the ceremony of a small state event. The palace tightened. Corridors became quiet. Staff moved with careful speed. Doctors arrived as if they were joining a procession. The old traditions hovered in the air like perfume. There were rules about who could be present, who could be informed, who could sign what. Even a birth, the most human thing in the world, was managed like paperwork. Elizabeth was brave, but bravery does not mean a person enjoys being treated like an object. In the hours of pain, she discovered a new kind of anger, not loud but steady. She was not going to spare Andy her life, surrendering control of herself. If she had to live inside this institution, she would live as a person, not as a vessel. On April 21st, 1926, their first child arrived, a girl. She was tiny, dark-haired, and perfectly ordinary in the way babies are, except for the fact that she carried history in her name. They called her Elizabeth, and the family did what families always do with a new baby. They crowded close, they softened, they argued about who the baby resembled. They pretended the future was certain. For Albert, the baby was a miracle. He held her with a careful tenderness that made him look suddenly younger, as if fatherhood had loosened the tight knot of worry inside him. For Elizabeth, the baby was love and alarm all at once. She loved her child fiercely, then immediately saw the danger. This little girl would not be allowed to be simply a girl. She would be watched, trained, judged, and possibly used. Elizabeth's protective instincts, already strong, turned sharper. Queen Mary came to see the baby with an expression that suggested she was evaluating a small new official. She admired children, but she admired them the way she admired order. She approved of their existence, then expected them to behave. She looked at her granddaughter, then at Elizabeth, then offered a few precise remarks about routine and propriety. Elizabeth listened, smiled, and thanked her. Then, when Queen Mary left, Elizabeth told her own staff exactly how she wanted the nursery run. It was not a rebellion, it was a declaration. This child belonged to her parents first. The nursery became Elizabeth's kingdom, and, like any kingdom, it revealed the kind of ruler she was. She was affectionate, playful, attentive. She also expected competence. If a nurse was careless, Elizabeth noticed. If a maid was late, Elizabeth noticed. If someone tried to impose a palace tradition that did not suit her child, Elizabeth noticed, and Elizabeth stopped it. It was here that the stories about her began to take shape, the ones that would later be sharpened into nastier words. Some staff adored her because she treated them like people and defended them when others looked down on them. Some staff disliked her because she demanded standards and did not accept excuses. A woman who expects the world to do its job can be described as strong. She can also be described as difficult. The choice often depends on whether you are the one being expected to do the job. Elizabeth did not care what people called her, so long as they did what needed doing. Money decisions became quieter but more urgent. Albert's allowance had to cover the life of a public couple with private needs, and the bills of royalty do not come with modesty. There were staff wages, travel, costs, clothing, charities, and endless small obligations. Elizabeth had taste, but she also had a talent for making the right choice, doses once, rather than making a poor choice repeatedly. She reweaved dresses when she could. She chose fabrics that looked luxurious without screaming for attention. She understood that the public liked a duchess who looked elegant, not wasteful. A woman can spend a fortune and still look cheap. Elizabeth spent carefully and looked expensive, which is a different skill. Their London home at 145 Piccadilly became more than an address. It became a refuge. It was not vast by palace standards, but it was theirs. Elizabeth filled it with warmth, with familiar objects, with friends who made Albert laugh. She insisted on dinner, parties that felt like real gatherings, not state rehearsals. She kept the atmosphere human. She also kept a careful eye on who came through the door, because in their world, every visitor brought a hint of politics with them. Albert grew more confident in private and more strained in public. His duties increased. He had to open things, to visit factories, to speak at events where people expected a prince to sound like a destiny. His stammer, the old enemy, returned whenever he felt pressure. Some people tried to pretend they did not notice. Others noticed and enjoyed noticing. Elizabeth noticed the enjoyment, and she stored it away. She did not allow herself to speak openly of her contempt for cruelty, at least not in public. Instead, she did what she had always done. She managed the room. If someone looked amused at Albert's struggle, Elizabeth would turn toward them with a smile so bright it felt like sunlight. Then she would exclude them from the rest of the evening without ever saying a rude word. The person would leave thinking they had not had a chance to speak with her. Elizabeth would leave knowing she had punished them perfectly. Albert knew what she was doing. He loved her for it, and he feared it a little. It is unsettling to realize the person who protects you could also destroy you if you ever stood in her way. In 1925, Albert was scheduled to speak at Wembley, at the closing ceremony of the British Empire exhibition. It was a grand public moment, the kind that made the newspapers and made the palace proud. Albert dreaded it for weeks. He tried to practice. He tried to control his breathing. He tried everything he could think of. On the day his voice caught, his words broke and the silence between his syllables felt louder than the crowd. Elizabeth watched from the side with her hands clasped so tightly her rings pressed into her skin. When it was over, Albert looked as if he had been physically beaten. Elizabeth did not comfort him with empty praise. She did not say it was fine because it was not fine. Instead, she said calmly that it was time they stopped hoping it would get better on its own. Hope was lovely, she said, but it was not a method. She found him help. Not the sort of help the palace preferred, stiff and traditional, but a man from outside the royal circle, an Australian speech therapist named Lionel Logg. The court did not like outsiders. Outsiders asked questions. Outsiders did not automatically bow to nonsense. Outsiders also sometimes solve problems the palace had chosen to tolerate. Albert was reluctant, partly from pride, partly from fear of yet another disappointment. Elizabeth did not nag. She made the appointment. She told Albert she would go with him. She told him he could be angry with her later, but he would be grateful sooner. Lowe's rooms were not a palace. There were no uniformed footmen and no polished corridors. There were chairs, a desk, a sense of ordinary life. Lowe spoke to the Duke of York like a person, not like a symbol. He made Albert red, breathe, swear when necessary. He pushed him, he teased him, he did not treat him like fragile china. Elizabeth sat through sessions with the patience of a woman watching a wall slowly move. She praised Albert when he improved. She did not indulge him when he wanted to quit. She understood that the stammer was not only a speech problem, it was a shame problem. Shame cannot be cured by pity. It can be cured by repetition, by trust, and by someone refusing to accept that humiliation is a permanent state. In those months, Elizabeth's role in Albert's life deepened. She was not only his wife, she was his coach, his shield, his audience, and his quiet commander. Albert began to speak better. Not perfectly, not effortlessly, but better. Each improvement gave him a little more dignity. Dignity made him less afraid. Less fear made his speech smoother. It became a circle in the right direction. As Albert gained confidence, Elizabeth gained something else. Influence, not the public kind, though she had that too, the private kind, the kind that moves decisions in quiet rooms. People began to understand that the Duke of York did not make choices alone. If you wanted Albert, you had to consider Elizabeth. Some men resented this. They preferred royal wives to be decorative. Some women resented it too, because influence is a competitive sport when it is denied official rules. Queen Mary observed it with a cool gaze. She respected strength. She also disliked challenges to her authority. Elizabeth and Queen Mary had a relationship like two skilled chess players forced to share a board. They could be cordial, even affectionate at times, but each always knew what the other was doing. Elizabeth learned when to yield. She learned when yielding was a trick. She also learned that if you give Queen Mary the appearance of control, you can take a surprising amount behind the scenes. Meanwhile, Edward continued to live as if the crown was something that would happen to him, not something that required him to change. He was handsome, charming, and impatient. He fell in love easily, or thought he did. He surrounded himself with fashionable friends, glittering parties, and women whose husbands pretended not to mind until they did. Edward's private life became an open secret, the sort of secret everyone knows and nobody says aloud at dinner, because it would ruin the soup. Elizabeth watched Edward with an interest that was not entirely kind. She did not dislike him. She could be pleasant with him. She could even laugh at his jokes, but she did not trust him. He treated duty like an outfit he put on when photographers were present. He treated rules as suggestions. He treated consequences as problems for later. The royal family relied on later. Later is where disasters live. In public, the Duke and Duchess of York became the steady couple. They visited coal mines, hospitals, shipyards. They shook hands until their wrists ached. Elizabeth learned how to speak to people in a way that made them feel seen. A factory wife might curtsy awkwardly and blush. Elizabeth would lean in, speak softly, and ask about her children, about her husband's health, about the small details that mattered in ordinary life. She remembered names. She wrote notes afterward. She sent flowers when someone was ill. The recipients would tell the story for years. It was genuine kindness, and it was also extremely useful. Elizabeth understood that popularity is a form of protection. If the public loves you, the palace has less room to punish you. If the palace cannot punish you, you can shape it. The country itself was uneasy. There were strikes, hard winters, political arguments that felt sharper than before. In 1926, the general strike brought Britain to a halt for days. Coal stopped moving. Trains stopped. Newspapers appeared late or not, at all. Some people panicked, some people cheered. Most people simply tried to get on with feeding their families. For the royal family, it was a test. The public wanted reassurance, but also fairness. Elizabeth saw quickly that empty grandeur would not help. She urged Albert to be visible, to visit, to listen. Albert did, and Elizabeth stood beside him, calm and composed, the picture of stability. Privately, she worried. She worried about the anger she could feel in crowds. She worried about how quickly people could turn on symbols if the symbol seemed blind. She worried about her daughter's future. She worried about money, too, because strikes and unrest made everything more fragile, even for the wealthy. Estates suffered, investments wobbled. The old certainty that Britain would always be Britain began to feel less certain. Elizabeth did not allow herself to panic. Panic is contagious. Instead, she became more organized, more determined, more precise. If the world was going to shake, she wanted to be holding the table when it did. At home, the little Elizabeth grew from baby to child, curious and observant. She watched her parents the way intelligent children do, as if collecting evidence. She learned that her mother's smile could mean affection or warning. She learned that her father's gentleness had a spine under it. Elizabeth, the mother, adored her daughter, but she did not indulge foolishness. She expected manners. She expected self-control. She expected the child to understand, even before the child could fully understand. That their life was different, it might sound harsh. It was also preparation. Elizabeth had no intention of letting the palace teach her daughter hardness without love. She would teach it with love and with laughter and with an insistence on dignity. In 1930, another pregnancy arrived, and this time Elizabeth met it with less fear and more irritation at the inconvenience, not because she did not want the child, but because she was beginning to dislike how much the world felt entitled to her. She was older now, more seasoned. She knew which doctors she wanted. She knew which traditions she would tolerate. She knew which women would be allowed near her when she was vulnerable. Their second daughter, Margaret, was born on August 21st, 1930. She arrived with a different energy, more impish, more demanding, as if she had entered the world already negotiating for better terms. Elizabeth laughed at her, delighted. Albert was relieved. There were no complications, and then he looked at his two daughters with the stunned expression of a man who had wanted a family so badly he had not quite believed it would come. Two daughters meant the line of succession remained a topic, a quiet one, but still present. In those days, sons were still considered the desired outcome for dynasties, as if a country could not be served by a girl. Elizabeth did not say much about that, but anyone who looked closely could see she was not disappointed. She had produced heirs. She had produced a future. If the palace wanted to pout because the future wore pinners instead of trousers, the palace could pout in private. As the girls grew, Elizabeth's protectiveness sharpened further. She hated the idea of them being handled by cold hands. She insisted on family meals when possible. She insisted on bedtime, stories, on walks, on moments that belonged to them. She also insisted on discipline. The royal household was full of adults who would flatter the children into nonsense. Elizabeth refused to allow it. She wanted her daughters to be loved, not spoiled. This combination, warmth and strictness, confused some people. They wanted royal women to be either sweet or severe, not both. Elizabeth could be both in the same sentence. If a child misbehaved in public, Elizabeth did not scold theatrically. She simply looked. The child would feel the look and correct herself because the look carried absolute expectation. People who admired her called it good mothering. People who disliked her called it controlling. Elizabeth, as usual, did not care what they called it. She also began to notice something about the palace gossip machine. Stories traveled upward. A maid's complaint could reach a courtier. A courtier's opinion could reach a royal ear. A royal ear could decide a person's fate. Elizabeth began to manage not only her household, but the narrative of her household. If someone was loyal and competent, she rewarded them. If someone was careless or cruel, she removed them quietly. She did not enjoy cruelty for its own sake. She enjoyed order. The difference matters, but gossip does not always respect nuance. There were small feuds, the sort that never make newspapers, but can poison a family. A lady-in-waiting who believed Elizabeth should defer more. A courtier who believed the Duchess of York was becoming too prominent. A friend of Edward's who believed Elizabeth was judging him, which she was, and it made him uncomfortable. Elizabeth handled these feuds the way she handled everything. She smiled, she waited, she applied pressure at exactly the right point. Sometimes that meant inviting the right person to dinner and excluding another. Sometimes it meant a remark delivered with such sweetness that the target could not protest without seeming unhinged. Sometimes it meant a letter, private and firm, reminding someone of their place in the hierarchy. Hierarchy in the royal world was a language. Elizabeth spoke it fluently. Albert's confidence continued to grow under Log's guidance and under Elizabeth's insistence that he stop apologizing for existing. He began to take on more engagements. He began to feel occasionally that he might be capable of being more than a supporting character in his brother's story. This shift did not please everyone. Some people preferred Albert anxious because anxious men are easier to steer. Some people preferred Elizabeth decorative because decorative women are easier to dismiss. As Albert strengthened, Elizabeth's influence became harder to ignore, and the palace does not enjoy anything it cannot control. Queen Mary, ever the guardian of the institution, watched the York household with a certain weary respect. She could see the difference Elizabeth had made in Albert. She could see the public's affection. She could see that the Duchess of York was becoming a central figure, even without being at the center of succession. Queen Mary's mind was too strategic not to notice this. She did not stop it. She could not without looking petty. Instead, she adjusted the way clever people adjust. She offered approval in measured doses. She kept Elizabeth close, enough to observe and distant enough to remind her who set the rules. Elizabeth accepted the closeness and ignored the reminder. By the early 1930s, as the world slid into economic hardship and unemployment rose, the royal family's image became even more important. People were suffering, people were angry. They wanted to know what the royals were for beyond ceremony. The Duke and Duchess of York leaned into the kind of work that made sense to the public. Hospitals, charities, visits, that looked like service rather than spectacle. Edward, meanwhile, continued to chase pleasure with the determination of a man trying to outrun boredom. He was still adored, but there were murmurs now, quieter than applause, but more dangerous. A future king was expected to marry suitably and settle. Edward did not seem to want to settle with anyone the palace approved of. He liked married women, fashionable women, women who treated him like a man rather than like a monument. The palace feared scandal, not because it disliked sin, but because it disliked loss of control. Elizabeth began to hear more names, more whispers, women with influence, women with complicated reputations, women who were not going to be easily pushed aside if Edward became attached. Elizabeth did not yet know which attachment would become the one that mattered most, but she could feel the shape of the problem approaching like distant thunder. King George V was aging, his health not what it had been. He still carried himself with the stubborn pride of a man determined to embody stability, but the strain showed. The family gathered around him with the cautious tenderness. People show a patriarch who has ruled their lives. Queen Mary remained dutiful, steady, and unyielding. Edward visited, smiled, made promises, then disappeared into his own world. Albert visited more reliably with Elizabeth beside him, and the king seemed to relax slightly, so in their presence, as if their steadiness soothed his irritation. Elizabeth noticed the king's relief. She noticed the way courtiers watched Edward's absences and Albert's dependability. She noticed how quickly people begin to reposition themselves when they smell a change in the air. She went home one evening, kissed her daughters good night, then sat with Albert in a quiet room and listened to him speak about the future in a careful voice. He did not say what neither of them wanted to say. He did not say that Edward might not be fit for the role that waited for him. He did not say that if Edward stumbled, the burden could fall on Albert's shoulders. Elizabeth did not say it either. She did not need to. They both felt it in the space between sentences. Elizabeth reached for Albert's hand and held it as if anchoring him. Albert looked at her searching. She gave him a small smile that was both comfort and command. Whatever she ohms, the smile seemed to say, "We will manage it. In the nursery upstairs, two little girls slept unaware of the storm forming around their family. In the palace corridors, courtiers murmured, calculating. In the newspapers, the Prince of Wales still glittered, still smiled, still looked like the future. And Elizabeth, Duchess of York, sat in the lamplight with her husband and felt something settle inside her, not fear exactly, but readiness. The quiet, stubborn readiness of a woman who has learned that the world will take what it can unless you decide firmly and politely what it is not allowed to have. Readiness did not feel heroic. It felt like learning where the exits were and who would try to block them. By the time the girls were old enough to chatter through breakfast, Elizabeth had learned the palace's rhythms as if they were a second heartbeat. She knew which footmen carried gossip with their trays. She knew which ladies in waiting had sharp ears and sharper loyalties. She knew which relatives smiled in public and tallied in private. In a family where affection and competition lived in the same rooms, information was not merely useful, it was protection. She also learned something uncomfortable about herself. She enjoyed the contest, not in the obvious way, not with open conflict or grand speeches. She enjoyed the quieter victories, the moment when an awkward situation dissolved because she had steered the conversation, the moment when a courtier realized he could not bully her husband without paying a price. She enjoyed being underestimated because it made the wind cleaner. Albert benefited from her, and the country did, too, though the country did not know it. Yet, when he spoke now, he spoke with more control. When he appeared in public, he looked less like a man waiting to be corrected. He was still shy. He still dreaded certain rooms, but he had learned how to endure. And endurance was a kind of power in a family that relied on appearances. There, home at Piccadilly felt like a working household rather than a museum. There were toys in corners, books left open, laughter that did not sound rehearsed. Elizabeth insisted on those details because the royal world had a way of turning everything into display. She refused to let her children grow up as display objects if she could help it, even though she knew with a cold clarity that she could only help it so much. Little Elizabeth, the elder daughter, was thoughtful and serious. She watched people the way her mother watched people, quietly collecting their habits. Margaret was brighter in her mischief, quicker to test limits, as if she had arrived, already impatient with rules. Elizabeth loved them both fiercely, and she loved them differently, which is what mothers do and what children always notice. She set expectations early. She did not allow screaming fits in public. She did not allow rudeness to staff. She also did not allow her girls to be frightened of the palace. She wanted them to be comfortable in it because discomfort makes people easy to control. Some in the household thought she was too strict, others thought she was too affectionate. Elizabeth never tried to satisfy them. She was raising daughters, not a committee. In those years, Britain's hardship was not something you could ignore, even from behind palace gates. The Depression hit families who had never imagined. Hunger could be theirs. Men queued for work. Women learned how to stretch meals until even the potatoes looked tired. The royal family's popularity could not be taken for granted. People had less patience for luxury. They wanted symbols, yes, but they wanted symbols that appeared to understand them. Elizabeth understood them, or at least she understood what they wanted to feel. She became skilled at these small gestures that made headlines without seeming like headlines. A visit to a hospital that did not look like a performance, a conversation with a widow that did not look hurried, a smile that looked as if it belonged to the person receiving it, not to the camera. She also understood something else. Compassion can be sincere and still be strategic. She did not see a contradiction. In her world, sincerity without strategy was a form of carelessness. Edward, the Prince of Wales, was the opposite. He was sincere in his appetites and careless with the rest. He adored the attention of crowds, and crowds adored him back. He could walk into a room and make everyone feel as if they had been waiting for him. He could also walk out of obligations as if obligations were for people with less charm. The palace excused it because he was the heir. The public forgave it because he was handsome. Politicians tolerated it because they had to. Elizabeth watched it and thought not for the first time that charm was a lovely thing until you used it to avoid responsibility. Whispers about Edward's private life had been around for years, changing names as easily as changing seasons. He preferred married women, perhaps, because married women already had a structure around them, and structure was what he resisted in his own life. His affairs were spoken of softly, with the same careful discretion people used to discuss illnesses. It was considered vulgar to be direct. Then a different name began to reappear. An American woman, a sharper story. At first, Elizabeth heard it as background, like distant music at a party you are not attending. A Mrs. Simpson, people said, with a certain tone, not the tone of scandal yet, more like curiosity. She was witty, they said, stylish, clever. She had a way of speaking that made men feel as if they had been understood and teased at the same time. The palace did not love clever women unless the cleverness stayed quiet. Clever women could not be easily managed. Elizabeth met Mrs. Simpson Wallace in the way these meetings happen, not as a formal introduction under chandeliers, but as a moment in a social setting where the right people make sure you are in the same room and pretend it happened naturally. Wallace was smaller than some expected, with sharp features that made her expressions look deliberate. She had confidence that did not ask permission. She did not behave like a woman hoping to be accepted. She behaved like a woman deciding what she found acceptable. Elizabeth recognized the type immediately because she herself was the type only polished in a different school. They spoke. Wallace was charming. Elizabeth was charming back. Their smiles were the kind people use when they are measuring one another. Later, Elizabeth would be accused of disliking Wallace out of snobbery. There was snobbery in the air, certainly because the royal court was built on it. But Elizabeth's reaction was not simply that Wallace was American or divorced once or married again. Elizabeth was not naive enough to think the upper world was pure. She had seen plenty of marriages built on convenience and maintained by discretion. If morality were the true concern, half the drawing rooms in London would have been closed for repairs. Elizabeth's concern was control. Wallace did not look controllable, and Edward was a man who did not enjoy being controlled. Put those two together, and you did not get romance. You got a fire. Edward began to prefer Wallace's company openly, in the careless way that suggested he believed rules were for other people. He invited her to weekends. He arranged for her to be near him at events. He laughed with her in front of others as if he wanted them to notice. Some in society found it thrilling, some found it vulgar, most found it dangerous because they understood how thin the line was between private indulgence and public crisis. Albert heard the whispers too, and his face would tighten in that familiar way. That meant anxiety had found a new place to live. He wanted to believe the best of his brother. He wanted to believe Edward would eventually settle, eventually marry, suitably, eventually do what was expected. Albert still carried the family habit of loyalty. Elizabeth carried the family habit of realism. She did not lecture Albert. She did not need to. She simply asked questions. What happens if Edward insists? She would say quietly, as if discussing weather. What happens if the government objects? What happens if the church objects? What happens if the public turns? What happens to the girls? The last question landed most heavily, because it was the question with a face. Their daughters were not abstract. They were little hands and bedtime stories and the smell of soap after a bath. Albert would look at Elizabeth then, and for a moment the fear in his eyes would be so naked that it almost embarrassed him. Elizabeth would take his hand and squeeze it once, not as comfort, but as a reminder that fear could be used as fuel. While Edward's private life swelled like a storm, King George V's health declined. He had been the image of duty for decades, the man people pictured when they pictured stability. He had held the monarchy through war, through labor unrest, through the slow erosion of the old order. He had done it by being stubborn and by believing that if the crown behaved properly, the country would behave properly too. But age does not respect duty. The king's cough grew worse. He tired more quickly. There were days when his face looked grey around the mouth, and courtiers pretended not to notice. Queen Mary watched him with the controlled worry of a woman trained to keep fear out of her expression. She did not soften much. Softness in her mind was for private rooms. Even then, she did not trust it. When the family gathered, the king's irritation often fell on Edward. It was not gentle irritation. It was the irritation of a man who had worked his whole life to embody responsibility, watching his heir treated like a costume. The king's temper was known, and so was his disappointment. In private, he was rumored to say things that were too sharp to repeat in public. He did not hide his view that Edward was selfish. He did not hide his worry that the crown would be at risk in the hands of a man who preferred pleasure. Edward, for his part, behaved as if the king's disapproval were unfair, and unfairness was something he could not tolerate. He could tolerate scandal, he could tolerate gossip, but he could not tolerate being told he was wrong. When his father's health worsened, Edward's visits were still unpredictable, still shaped by Edward's own schedule. People noticed Elizabeth, noticed most of all. There was a day during one of the king's weaker spells when Elizabeth was summoned to see Queen Mary. The message was delivered with the careful formality that suggested the topic would not be comfortable. Elizabeth entered the room, curtsied, and found the Queen sitting upright as always, even when worry had carved deeper lines around her mouth. Queen Mary did not waste time. She spoke of the king's condition, of the need for the family to be united, of the importance of duty. Her voice was even, but her hands were tight on the armrest. She then spoke of Edward without using his name at first, as if saying it might summon the problem fully into the room. She mentioned the woman in the same way, as if refusing the name could reduce the danger. Elizabeth listened, face calm, as if receiving instructions for a household rather than for the future of the monarchy. When Queen Mary finished, there was a pause. The Queen's eyes rested on Elizabeth with a rare directness. Queen Mary asked quietly what Elizabeth thought. It was a trap and an opening at the same time. If Elizabeth spoke too strongly, she would seem ambitious. If she spoke too softly, she would seem foolish. Elizabeth chose her words with the care of a woman arranging fragile objects. She said that the public wanted stability and the public's patience was not endless. She said that love stories could charm a country, but scandals could sour it. She said very gently that the institution must not appear to be ruled by private appetites. Queen Mary's mouth tightened. She did not disagree. She did not agree either. She simply said, as if stating the obvious, that the crown must be protected. Elizabeth nodded. Then she said something that Queen Mary had not expected, something that showed Elizabeth's steel under her softness. She said that the crown could only be protected by people who were willing to endure the unglamorous parts of it, the endless obligations, the boredom, the pressure. She said the public forgave human flaws, but it did not forgive contempt. Queen Mary stared at her a moment, then looked away. The Queen had spent her life swallowing emotion for duty. She did not enjoy hearing the truth spoken aloud, even if it was her own truth. Yet she respected it. When Elizabeth left, she knew something had shifted. The Queen had not asked her by accident. The Queen had asked because the Queen was beginning to imagine the possibility that the crown might not sit on Edward's head as smoothly as everyone pretended it would. Elizabeth went home and found Albert in a study, staring at papers without reading them. She told him about the conversation without dramatizing it. Albert listened, face pale. When she finished, he said in a small voice that he did not want it, whatever it was. Elizabeth did not pretend she could remove the possibility from the world by wishing. She simply said calmly that wanting did not matter as much as being ready. She told him that if a storm came, the people would look for someone steady, and he could be steady. He ked at her, as if she were asking him to lift a building. Elizabeth added softer that he would not have to do it alone. The nastiest stories about Elizabeth, the ones that would come later, often painted her as hungry for the crown. Hungry is a convenient word. It removes complexity. It allows people to imagine that any woman who prepares for disaster must secretly desire it. Elizabeth did not desire disaster. She desired control over how disaster would land. In the months that followed, Edward's attachment to Wallace deepened. It was no longer merely social. It was no longer merely gossip. People began to understand that he was not treating her like a passing diversion. He treated her like a companion, perhaps even like a leader. That was the part that unsettled the court. Edward was used to women admiring him. Wallace did not seem to admire so much as direct. There were weekends at Fort Belvedere, Edward's private sanctuary, where Wallace was present as if she belonged there. There were parties where she was seated too, close. There were whispers that Edward consulted her on matters he should not have consulted anyone on, least of all a married woman with her own complicated history. The more the palace resisted, the more Edward seemed determined to push. Elizabeth watched these developments with the cold attention of a woman reading a map of a river she might one day be forced to cross. She began to strengthen her own position without making it obvious. She encouraged Albert to accept more duties, to be seen more, to be the dependable brother. She encouraged him to maintain good relationships with ministers, not by politicking, but by being reliable. Reliability is a form of persuasion. She also began quietly to make sure their household was prepared for any future. She took greater interest in finances. She reviewed staff. She ensured that the girls' education could be adjusted if their roles changed. She did not speak of it to outsiders. She did not even speak of it much to Albert, because Albert's mind could be overwhelmed by the weight of what might happen. Elizabeth carried the weight for both of them, as she often did. This was not purely selfless. It was her nature. She needed to act. Sitting and hoping made her restless. Action made her feel alive. There were still moments of ordinary family life. Picnics in the countryside where the girls ran on the grass, and Albert laughed in a way he rarely did in formal rooms. The evenings, when Elizabeth read to her daughters, using voices that were surprisingly silly for a woman so precise in public, those moments mattered. They reminded Elizabeth what she was protecting. Yet, even those moments were touched by the larger story. On a summer afternoon, while the girls played, Elizabeth overheard a servant mention the king's health in a whisper. The servant did not know Elizabeth was near. The words were ordinary, but the tone carried fear. Elizabeth felt the familiar sensation of weather changing. King George V grew weaker. His doctors became more present. His routines were adjusted. The family moved around him with a carefulness that could feel like love and could also feel like strategy. Edward visited, sometimes attentive, sometimes distracted. When he was attentive, he could be charming even with his father. When he was distracted, the king's anger burned hotter, and the room would tighten. There was a gathering at Sandringham, the king's beloved retreat. The family sat in a room that smelled of wood polish and old money. The king was in a chair wrapped in blankets, though the fire burned. His face looked carved, the cheeks hollow, the eyes still sharp. Edward sat nearby, restless, as if the quiet irritated him. Albert sat stiffly, trying to look calm. Elizabeth sat beside her husband, hands folded, face serene. The king spoke of duty, of the country, of the crown. His voice was rough. He spoke to Edward directly, and the words were not gentle. He urged him to settle, to marry, to stop embarrassing the family. Edward's jaw tightened. He attempted a light reply, a joke perhaps, but the king's stare cut through it. The room went silent. Elizabeth watched Edward in that silence. Edward looked like a boy being scolded, and the boy part of him hated it. He did not apologize. He did not promise. He simply withdrew behind charm, as if charm could shield him from truth. Afterward, in a corridor, Elizabeth encountered Edward alone. He looked irritated, then tried to turn irritation into amusement. He made a remark about their father being old-fashioned. Elizabeth smiled politely. Then she said, in a quiet voice, that the king was not old-fashioned. He was frightened. She said he was frightened for the crown and for the country and for his sons. Edward's expression flickered. He did not like being accused of causing fear. He preferred to believe he brought joy. He said something about living his own life. Elizabeth's smile did not change. She said softly that he could live his own life after he had done the job he was born into. Until then, his life belonged to the public as mem. Such as to him. Edward stared at her, and for a moment the charm fell away. He looked at her as if she had slapped him. Then the charm returned brighter, more brittle. He said she sounded like their mother. Elizabeth answered that their mother had been right about many things, even if she did not enjoy being right. Edward walked away, and Elizabeth knew she had made an enemy in the way you make enemies in royal life, not with insults, but with truth. Was it wise? Perhaps not. But Elizabeth did not always choose the wisest path. She chose the path that protected what she valued. Sometimes that protection required confrontation, even if it was wrapped in velvet. The king's last months were heavy. Queen Mary remained steadfast, managing the household, managing the family, managing the press. She was the kind of woman who could watch her world shift and still insist on proper posture. Elizabeth admired her and disliked her in equal measure, which is often what happens when two strong women share a stage. They understood each other too well. On the evening the king's condition worsened sharply, the palace moved into its most controlled form of chaos. Messages were sent, doctors conferred, courtiers spoke in hushed voices as if volume might offend death. Elizabeth was called to the palace. Albert was already there, pale and tense. He did not speak much. He did not need to. His fear hung in the air like smoke. Elizabeth stood beside him, calm, and she did something that would become her instinct whenever a crisis arrived. She took command of the small things. She asked who had eaten. She ensured someone brought tea. She spoke to staff with quiet authority. She made sure Albert had a private room where he could breathe. She did not weep in corridors. She did not collapse. She saved her emotion for later, because later is where emotion can be afforded. King George V died on January 20th, 1936. The announcement went out, and the country responded the way countries respond to the death of a symbol. There was grief genuine for many. There was also apprehension. People knew Edward would become king. They also knew Edward was not his father. The palace entered mourning. Curtains were drawn. Black fabric appeared. Faces became solemn. Elizabeth wore mourning with the same composure she wore everything else. She had grieved before. She knew grief does not stop the clock. Edward became king, and for a moment the story looked simple. A new reign, a popular monarch, a fresh beginning. Crowds cheered. Newspapers printed flattering photographs. The king smiled, and the country smiled back, because the country wanted to believe. Inside the family, the mood was more complicated. Queen Mary was now the Queen Mother, and she carried her sorrow with the same discipline she carried duty. She was proud, certainly. She was also wary. Edward's charm could not soothe her worry. She knew her son too well. Albert was now next in line. He did not say it aloud because saying it would make it real. He grew quieter. He slept poorly. He practiced speeches more, not because anyone asked him to, but because his mind had begun to anticipate a future he did not want. Elizabeth watched him and felt her own readiness tighten like a corset pulled one notch further. She did not speak of destiny. She spoke of schedules, of duty, of keeping their family steady. She kept Albert's days full, enough that he could not drown in his thoughts. She kept his evenings calm enough that he could rest. Edward, meanwhile, acted quickly to reshape his household. He wanted less formality. He wanted more freedom. He wanted above all to bring Wallace closer to the center of his life without being told no. He believed that as king he could do what he liked. It is a common belief among kings, and it is almost always wrong. Wallace's position became more visible. and the visibility made the whispering sharper. Some courtiers were appalled, some were excited, some, always practical, began to align themselves with whichever future they thought was coming. Elizabeth noticed these alignments, these subtle changes in invitations, the way certain faces appeared more often at Fort Belvedere, the way others began to avoid it. At a small gathering not long after the king's death, Elizabeth encountered Wallace again. Wallace was composed, almost serene, as if the death of a king and the rise of her lover had merely changed the lighting in the room. She spoke with her usual ease, her usual sharpness. She did not bow deeply. She did not behave like a woman humbled by proximity to power. She behaved like a woman who believed she belonged near it. Elizabeth smiled at her and exchanged polite words. Beneath the politeness, each woman understood the other was dangerous. Wallace was dangerous because she could bend Edward. Elizabeth was dangerous because she could outlast him. Afterward, Elizabeth found herself alone for a moment with a courtier who had served the family for decades. He spoke cautiously, as if speaking too plainly might be treason. He hinted at the king's intentions. He hinted at the government's unease. He hinted at the possibility that the new king might force a crisis. Elizabeth listened, thanked him, and said nothing of her own thoughts. She did not reveal strategy to people who might repeat it. She went home that evening and sat with Albert by the fire, the girls upstairs, asleep, the household quiet. Albert asked, in a voice that tried to sound casual and failed, whether she thought Edward would do something foolish. Elizabeth looked at her husband, then at the flames, then back at him. Her voice was steady. She said that Edward had always done what pleased him, and now he would do it with a crown on his head. She said that pleasure was not the same as wisdom. She said that if Edward pushed the country too far, the country would push back, and the crown would not protect him from that. Albert swallowed. He asked what would happen then. Elizabeth held his gaze. She did not soften the truth. She said that then the family would need someone who could carry duty without flinching. She did not say his name. She did not have to. Albert's face tightened. He whispered that he could not. Elizabeth reached across the small space between them and placed her hand over his. She said softly that he could, because he would have to. She said she would help him. She said the girls would need him. She said the country would need him. Albert's eyes filled and he looked away quickly, ashamed of tears. Elizabeth did not shame him further. She simply sat there, hand on his, and let the silence do what it always did in their marriage. It made the truth unavoidable. Outside, London moved on, because London always moves on. Inside the palace, a new reign began to show. Its cracks. The new king wanted his woman close. Ministers wanted the king to behave. The church wanted tradition. The public wanted romance and stability at the same time, as if those two things always traveled together. Elizabeth, Duchess of York, sat in her home and felt the future approaching. It did not sound like cheers. It sounded like a door being opened in a corridor you had hoped would stay closed. In the weeks after the funeral, it became fashionable to call the new reign modern before anyone had seen what it would do, with a difficult afternoon. Edward had always loved the idea of being close to the people, which sounded noble until you noticed he meant the people who applauded him. He enjoyed shaking hands. He enjoyed the flash of cameras. He enjoyed the sensation of a crowd lifting him like a wave. He did not enjoy paperwork routine or the quiet hours when a monarch must sit still with dull decisions and pretend dullness is a virtue. He also did not enjoy being told no. At first, London played along. Newspapers printed handsome photographs. Courtiers repeated hopeful phrases. Ministers tried to interpret the king's moods the way a farmer interprets the sky. Edward smiled through it, then hurried back to the places where he felt most himself. Small dinners with the same glittering set, long nights where the talk was easy and the rules were optional. Wallace was there more often than ever, and she did not fade into the background the way a discreet woman might have. She had a way of being present that made absence impossible. She laughed at Edward's jokes, and also corrected him, which delighted him. She had opinions which he found refreshing. She told him he deserved happiness, which he believed. She also seemed to believe that happiness should be arranged quickly before the world had time to interfere. The world, unfortunately, had been waiting its turn. Elizabeth watched the early days of the new reign with the calm of a woman who had seen families pretend. She and Albert attended the required events, stood in the right places, wore the right expressions. They did not criticize Edward in public. They did not feed rumors. The royal family's first rule was unity in public, even when unity was a fiction. In private, Elizabeth's mood was less forgiving. She had lived long enough to know that a man who insists on being happy at any cost eventually charges the bill to someone else. She also knew exactly who the someone else would be. It would be Albert. It would be their daughters. It would be the country. And if the country suffered, the royal family would suffer, and the suffering would not fall evenly. It would fall hardest on the people who had kept their promises. Those people were rarely rewarded. They were simply expected to keep going. Edward began to hint, then state, then insist that he intended to marry Wallis once she was free. Free was the polite word. The plain word was divorced, and in that era, divorce in royal circles carried the scent of smoke, as if merely saying it might set something on fire. The complication was not only the court's snobbery, though the court had plenty. It was the church. The monarch was expected to be tied to the Church of England, and the Church of England did not approve of a man marrying a woman whose former husband was still alive, especially not when she had already been divorced once. Ministers were wary, not because they were sentimental, but because they understood the country's limits. A king could push. The government could push back. The public might cheer a romance, but it might also turn if it felt its traditions were being mocked. Edward treated these concerns as obstacles, and Edward did not like obstacles. Elizabeth found herself spending more time with Albert in quiet rooms, the kind where you could speak honestly without footmen carrying your sentences away. Albert would pace, then stop, then sit, then stand again like a man trying to find a shape that could contain his anxiety. He asked Elizabeth whether she believed Edward would really do it. Elizabeth did not answer immediately. She had learned that immediate answers can look emotional, and emotional answers are too easy to dismiss. She waited until Albert met her eyes, until he was forced to see she was serious. Then she said yes. She said Edward would do it because he believed his will was a virtue, and he had never learned the difference between will and selfishness. Albert flinched as if the word selfishness were too harsh for a brother. Elizabeth softened her tone, without softening the truth. She said Edward had been adored for so long that he had started to confuse adoration with rightness. She said a man who is always admired becomes frightened of ordinary life, and frightened men do strange things to keep the admiration coming. Albert swallowed. He said he could not bear the thought of being forced into the role Edward was meant to have. Elizabeth reached for his hand and held it. She did not tell him not to worry. She told him what she always told him when the world moved toward She told him they would do what had to be done. She told him fear was allowed, but surrender was not. It was not a sentimental marriage. It was a functional one built on affection and on the shared understanding that feelings were not the most important thing in their lives. Duty was. Elizabeth was often praised for supporting Albert. Support sounds gentle. Sometimes it was. Sometimes it was pressure applied steadily, like a hand on your back pushing you up a hill you did not want to climb. In the summer, Edward and Wallis took their relationship out into bright sunlight, as if they believed sunlight could purify it. They traveled, they appeared together. They behaved like a couple, without bothering to hide behind social excuses. Foreign newspapers printed photographs and stories. British newspapers stayed oddly quiet, partly from old habits, partly from quiet pressure, partly because many editors still believed some subjects should be handled with discretion. Discretion in Britain often meant pretending you did not see what was directly in front of you, but people saw anyway. Americans saw, Canadians saw, the English saw through whispers and through foreign clippings passed like contraband. The silence began to feel less like dignity and more like cowardice, and cowards are not respected for long. When Wallace's divorce proceedings at Barnum's began, the air in London changed. Divorce was no longer a rumor. It was a legal fact moving forward. There were lawyers, statements, dates. The romance had stepped out of drawing rooms and into courts, where the world could point at it and call it real. Edward met with the Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, and told him he intended to marry Wallace after the divorce. Baldwin, a man shaped by caution, listened and then responded with calm firmness. The government could not support it, he said. The Dominions could not support it, he said. The Church would not support it, he said. The country might not support it, he said. A king could not simply treat the crown like a personal ring he could hand to whomever he pleased. Edward reacted as Edward always reacted when told no. He grew indignant. He spoke of love. He spoke of happiness. He spoke of modern times. He spoke as if the government were being unreasonable, which was a convenient way to avoid asking whether he was. Baldwin did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He had the one power Edward did not truly understand. The power to let a king embarrass himself in public. Politicians can survive scandal by shrugging. Monarchs cannot. Monarchs are meant to be the ceiling, and if the ceiling cracks, everyone sees. Edward offered a compromise, the sort of compromise men offer when they want everything, but are willing to rearrange the words. He suggested a morganatic marriage, a marriage in which Wallace would not become queen. He would marry her, he would keep the crown, and she would remain officially slightly to the side. The idea sounded clever until you noticed it required the government to create an entirely new arrangement for a king's private happiness. The government did not like being asked to rearrange centuries of tradition for one man's romance, especially when that man looked annoyed at having to ask. Baldwin refused. Ministers across the Commonwealth expressed disapproval. Even people who enjoyed scandal began to look tired of it. The king was not meant to be the starring actor in a social drama. He was meant to be the backdrop, steady and dull, so the country could argue about everything else. In the royal family, conversations became sharper. Queen Mary was furious, though she kept her fury within strict boundaries. She believed the monarchy survived by sacrifice, and she could not forgive a son who treated sacrifice as optional. She also believed the family's private life should serve the institution, not the other way around. If Edward wanted to marry for love, he should have chosen love that did not threaten the crown. Edward's stubbornness was not softened by his mother's disapproval. If anything, it hardened. He had always resented being managed by women, even as he depended on their admiration. Wallace admired him in a way that felt like strategy, and it pleased him. Queen Mary did not admire, she judged. Albert stayed mostly silent in these family storms because silence was safer for him. He feared confrontation. He also feared what confrontation might force him to admit. Elizabeth was not silent. She chose her moments, but when she spoke clearly. She made no grand speeches. She did not need to. She used short sentences, the kind that land and then stay. At a family dinner, when Edward grew dramatic about being denied happiness, Elizabeth replied that happiness was not a constitutional right, especially not for men who had been handed everything since birth. The room froze. A courtier coughed as if coughing could erase words. Edward stared at Elizabeth, his face flushing. Then he attempted a laugh. Then he failed at it. Elizabeth's expression remained calm, almost pleasant, which made the remark more dangerous. She had insulted him without sounding insulting. Edward did not forget it. Edward was the kind of man who forgave nothing that wounded his pride. Later that evening, Albert asked Elizabeth why she had provoked him. Elizabeth answered that Edward was already provoked by reality, and reality was going to win. She said it was better to make Edward understand that his family would not pretend he was noble when he was being selfish. Albert looked pained as if Elizabeth had taken a knife to family loyalty. Elizabeth looked almost tired. She said loyalty did not mean lying. This was the side of Elizabeth that some people hated. She could be warm and kind and funny, and then when she decided something mattered, she could become implacable. She did not shout. She did not rage. She simply held her position, smiling as if the other person's anger were an inconvenience, like rain on a planned picnic. In the palace, staff began to take sides quietly. They did not announce it. They showed it in their routines, in who was invited and who was not, in who received information early and who received it late. Some were loyal to Edward out of habit because he was the king. Some were loyal to Queen Mary because she embodied tradition. Some were loyal to the Yorks because they sensed the future might be moving toward them. Elizabeth watched these shifting loyalties with a practiced eye. She did not reward flattery. She rewarded usefulness. When a courtier offered her information, she thanked him and remembered it. When someone spoke carelessly about Albert's weakness, she made sure that person found fewer open doors in the coming weeks. The punishment was yet almost polite. It was also unmistakable. In private, Elizabeth's protectiveness grew almost fierce. She began to limit the girls' exposure to the palace's tension. She arranged their days to feel normal: lessons, play, walks, routines that made a child feel safe. Yet she also began to prepare them in small ways. She encouraged little Elizabeth to practice reading aloud with calm breathing, a gentle echo of what Albert was doing. She praised composure. She praised kindness. She praised steadiness. She was building brick by brick the sort of character that could survive being watched. She also began to speak more often with Baldwin and with other senior figures, not formally but socially, the way influence often works in Britain. A dinner, a tea, a conversation after an event. Elizabeth did not argue policy. She did not need to. She asked questions that framed the problem. She made it clear she understood the stakes. She made it clear that Albert would do what duty required if duty demanded it. Some later accused her of positioning. She was positioning. She would have been irresponsible not to. The difference is that positioning can be done for ambition or for protection. Elizabeth did not dream of being queen as a romantic prize. She dreaded the job. She also dreaded what would happen if the job fell to Albert and he was not ready. Dread can make a person efficient. As the crisis sharpened, the public began to notice the silence in British newspapers. Foreign reports grew louder. Ordinary people began to wonder what was being kept from them. When the story finally broke openly in Britain, the effect was not merely scandal. It was a kind of collective exhale. The secret everyone had been pretending not to know was now being said aloud, and once a secret is spoken, it becomes a problem you must solve. Letters poured into newspapers, into government offices, into the palace. Some supported the king's love because love stories are hard to resist. Some supported tradition because tradition feels like safety. Many were simply confused because they had been raised to believe the monarchy existed above ordinary mess. And here was he king behaving like a man in a public romance. Church leaders weighed in. Politicians weighed in. Dominion leaders weighed in. Everyone suddenly had an opinion about a woman they had never met in a marriage they would never attend. Wallis, for her part, was not visible in the way people expected. She withdrew from public view at moments, which only sharpened curiosity. Some said she was frightened. Some said she was calculating. Some said she was trapped by Edward's insistence. Some said she had orchestrated it all. The truth was likely a mixture, like most human stories. Wallis had entered a game she had not fully designed, and Edward had turned the stakes into a crisis by insisting the crown bend around him. Elizabeth did not pity Wallis. Pity was too soft for the situation. Elizabeth also did not behave as if Wallis were a villain in a fairy tale. Elizabeth understood that a man's choices were still his, and Edward was making his choices with both hands. But Elizabeth disliked Wallace deeply, not because Wallace was divorced, but because Wallace did not seem to respect the institution that held the country's emotional stability. Respect mattered to Elizabeth. It mattered almost too much. There was a private meeting at Buckingham Palace in early December, and the atmosphere was like a drawing room, filled with glass ornaments during an earthquake. Edward spoke with Baldwin again. Baldwin remained firm. The government would resign if Edward insisted. A king could not govern without a government. A constitutional monarch without ministers is simply a man in a fancy house. Edward raged at this fact as if facts had betrayed him personally. He spoke of being cornered. He spoke of being treated unfairly. He spoke of leaving. Leaving at first sounded like a threat meant to frighten the government. Then, it began to sound like the only solution that would allow Edward to keep both his pride and his woman. The word abdication began to hover. People did not like saying it. It sounded medieval. It sounded like chaos. But chaos was what Edward was producing, one stubborn choice at a time. Albert grew visibly thinner. He slept in short bursts. He became quiet even with Elizabeth. Sometimes he would sit staring at nothing, his mind rehearsing the worst. Elizabeth would find him like that and speak to him briskly, not unkindly but firmly, telling him to eat, telling him to rest, telling him to practice. She treated him like a man preparing for battle, because that is what he was. There were evenings when Albert would finally break and say in a voice full of despair that he could not do it. Elizabeth would answer in the same steady tone that he could not refuse if the country demanded it. She would not allow him the comfort of fantasy. She believed fantasy was the enemy of survival. It is a hard way to love someone. It is also the way some marriages last. Queen Mary, now more central than she wished to be, became a source of both pressure and support. She would summon Elizabeth for brief conversations, and in those conversations the Queen Mother would speak of tradition, duty, stability. She would speak of the king with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. She would speak of Albert as if he were a fragile object that might be forced into use. Elizabeth would listen and respond carefully. She did not flatter Queen Mary. She did not need to. Queen Mary did not require flattery. She required obedience. Elizabeth was not obedient in her nature, but she understood when cooperation was necessary. She offered Queen Mary assurance that Albert would do his duty. She also, in quieter phrases, asked Queen Mary not to crush Albert with anxiety before the burden even landed. Queen Mary's expression would tighten at that, because Queen Mary was not a woman who enjoyed being told she might do harm even while trying to protect. Yet she heard it. She began in her own controlled way to show Albert a rare gentleness. Not much, but enough to matter. The palace staff watched all of this tense as strings. Some dreaded the possibility of a new king because change disrupts routines and the palace is built on routines. Some dreaded it because they feared Albert's weakness. Some secretly hoped for it because they were tired of Edward's recklessness and wanted its stability again. Elizabeth heard the whispers and ignored the hope. Hope was too dangerous. She preferred preparation. And then the decision began to harden. Edward, faced with the government's refusal and the Commonwealth's opposition, found himself trapped by his own stubbornness. He could abandon Wallace and keep the crown. He could keep Wallace and abandon the crown. He could attempt to compromise and be publicly humiliated. His pride would not allow humiliation. His heart or his obsession would not allow abandoning Wallace. That left only one path, and once he saw the path, he started walking it with surprising speed, as if speed could make it look less like failure. In the days leading up to the final choice, Edward's behavior toward his family grew colder. He treated them as obstacles, not as loved ones. He treated Albert with a mixture of irritation and pity, two emotions that are difficult to forgive. He treated Elizabeth with open resentment because he believed she had judged him. She had. Edward could sense judgment the way some men sense perfume. There was a moment in a corridor when Edward spoke to Elizabeth in a low voice, words clipped. He said the family had never wanted him to be happy. He said they were all conspiring to take his throne. He said she in particular had always been ambitious. Elizabeth looked at him steadily. Her face remained composed. Then she said something that would echo in her own mind later, whether she admitted it or not. She said she had never wanted his throne. She said she wanted his responsibility. She said she would have gladly remained Duchess of York for the rest of her life if he had been willing to do his job. Edward's eyes narrowed. He said bitterly that she would get what she wanted. Elizabeth answered quietly that she would get what she feared. Edward walked away, and Elizabeth felt a flash of something that surprised even her. It was not only anger, it was also relief. Relief that the guessing might soon end. Relief that the country might soon have certainty again, even if certainty arrived like a blow. She did not allow herself to show that relief. Relief at another man's disgrace is not a good look, even when the disgrace is self-inflicted. In their home, the girls sensed tension, despite every effort to shield them. Little Elizabeth, thoughtful, asked questions with the polite seriousness of a child trying to behave like an adult. Margaret, more sensitive to mood than to words, became clingier, more mischievous, as if testing whether the world was still steady. One evening, Elizabeth tucked the girls into bed, and Lynn gared a little longer than usual. She kissed their foreheads, she smoothed hair. She spoke in a soft voice about ordinary things, school, ponies, stories. The girls listened and accepted the comfort, but their eyes stayed watchful. When Elizabeth left the nursery, she found Albert downstairs, standing near a window staring into darkness. He did not turn when she entered. He said in a small voice that he had been called to the palace the next day. Elizabeth moved beside him. She asked what Edward had said. Albert swallowed. He said Edward was going to do it. He was going to give up the crown. He was going to marry Wallace. He was going to leave. Albert's voice broke on the last word, not because he would miss Edward's presence, but because he knew what Edward's leaving meant for him. It meant the burden would fall. It meant the burden would fall on a man who had spent his life trying to be invisible in the family's brightest light. Elizabeth took Albert's hand and held it tightly. She did not cry. She did not gasp. She did not collapse. She simply stood there steady and let Albert feel her steadiness as if it were a wall he could lean on. Then she spoke, and her voice was calm enough to sound almost practical. She said they would go to the palace. She said they would listen carefully. She said they would do what the country required. She said they would not allow fear to make decisions for them. Albert turned then, and in the lamplight his face looked like a man being asked to step into a role that did not fit his body. He whispered that he did not want to be king. Elizabeth's expression softened just slightly. She said she knew. Then she added with the quiet firmness that had carried her through wars and palace rules and family storms, that wanting was no longer the relevant question. Outside London lights glimmered on wet streets. Inside a marriage braced itself. A crown was about to change hands, not with triumph, not with ceremony, but with a kind of grim necessity. The story the public thought it was watching, a romance with a handsome king, was about to become a different story entirely, and Elizabeth, Bose's lion, who had once refused to prince because she feared becoming a symbol, now stood at the edge of a fate she had tried to avoid, ready to step forward with a smile that would reassure a nation, and a resolve that would in time make people either adore her or call her something much less polite. The next morning brought a strange kind of stillness, the sort that settles over a household when everyone is waiting for a sound they do not want to hear. Elizabeth dressed with deliberate calm. She chose black, not because she enjoyed mourning, but because the palace would already be full of it, and she refused to arrive looking like a woman who had misunderstood the room. Albert barely touched breakfast. He stood, sat, stood again. When he tried to speak, His throat tightened, and he swallowed the words as if they were sharp. Elizabeth watched him with the steady patience she had learned as a girl in a crowded nursery, and then refined in palace corridors. She did not ask him to be brave in the dramatic way people demand bravery from others. She simply took his hand and said it was time. The drive to the palace felt shorter than it should have. London moved outside the windows as if it were any other day. Men in caps carried bundles. Omen stepped off curbs with shopping bags. A bus rolled past, full of faces turned inward, thinking about their own lives, not the crown. Elizabeth stared at those ordinary scenes and felt the odd split of royal existence. A nation could be about to change its monarch and still worry more about the price of bread. At the palace, the corridors were full of quiet. Staff spoke softly, doors closed gently. Even footsteps seemed muffled, as if the building itself was trying not to disturb what was about to happen. They were led into a room where Edward waited. He looked paler than usual, but not humble. His posture still carried the belief that the world should adjust around him. A few ministers were present, faces set in careful neutrality. Stanley Baldwin stood with the calm of a man who had spent weeks being told he was heartless by a king and had responded by continuing to be practical. Edward greeted Albert with a quick warmth that did not reach his eyes. He greeted Elizabeth even more briefly. There was a hint of hostility there, thin as a blade. Elizabeth met it with polite composure. She did not lower her gaze. She did not smile too widely. She gave him the exact amount of difference, required, and not a fraction more. The documents were brought. A pen was placed. Edward read, or pretended to. His hand shook slightly as he signed, then steadied, as if he had decided he would not be seen trembling. When it was done, there was a moment when nobody moved, as if the room had forgotten what people do after they change the course of history. Edward exhaled, then looked at Albert. His voice was quiet. He said it was done. He said he hoped Albert would be happy. The word happy, ended strangely. It sounded like a joke told at a funeral. Albert tried to answer. His mouth opened, his voice caught. The old panic rushed up like a tide. Elizabeth felt his hand tighten in hers. She moved slightly closer, not to hide him, but to anchor him. Albert managed a few words, stiff and simple. He said he would do his best. Edward's gaze flicked to Elizabeth then, as if he wanted to see whether she looked victorious. Elizabeth did not give him the satisfaction. She looked grave, almost distant, the way she had looked when she received the telegram about Fergus. A woman who knows grief does not celebrate other people's disasters, even when the disaster is earned. Edward's jaw tightened. He said a few more words about love and sacrifice, as if he wanted the room to admire him for leaving. Baldwin listened without expression, because Baldwin understood something Edward never did. There is a difference between sacrifice and choosing the option that feels best to you. When the meeting ended, Edward turned away quickly, as if staying another minute might force him to see what he had done. Albert stood still, as if his legs had forgotten their purpose. Elizabeth guided him out, hand firm on his arm. In the corridor, away from the ministers, away from the formal faces, Albert stopped and put her hand to his forehead like a man trying to hold his mind together. Elizabeth did not coo. She did not fuss. She said quietly that they had to keep moving. She said the country was watching, even if it could not see them. She said there was work. Work. The word was almost absurd. It sounded like something a clerk might say while sorting files. Yet that was the truth. The crown did not pass with romance. It passed with paperwork and exhaustion and the terrible knowledge that everyone expected you to make it look effortless. Within hours, Albert was king, not by desire, not by preparation, but by the sudden collapse of his brother's sense of duty. The palace began to shift around him. People adjusted their bows. Titles changed in mouths that had said the old ones yesterday. A new set of instructions was issued. A new set of rooms became relevant. Albert's first decision as king was his name. The family name was Still Albert, he had been Bertie since childhood, but the crown demanded something steadier, something that sounded like continuity rather than disruption. He chose George V, 6th. It was a direct link back to his father, a statement made without speeches. The country would not be flung into novelty. The country would be held. Elizabeth heard the choice and felt a tightness in her chest loosen slightly. George was safe. George was familiar. George sounded like a man who would do his job even when he hated it. There was no time to savor any comfort. The next days were filled with formalities that came like waves. Meetings with ministers, messages from the Commonwealth, instructions from the court, endless details that had to be settled. Even the question of where they would live felt like a battlefield disguised as tradition. Buckingham Palace was the official home. It was also a place that had never felt like theirs. Elizabeth had treated Piccadilly as a refuge. The palace felt like a stage, built by strangers. They moved anyway because kings move where kings are expected to be. Elizabeth walked into Buckingham Palace as queen and felt the walls close in. The rooms were grand, yes, but grandness can feel like cold. The staff looked at her differently now. Some looked pleased, as if they had been waiting for her. Some looked wary, as if they suspected she would rearrange more than furniture. She would. Queen Mary now, the Dowager Queen, was still present, still formidable. Grief had not softened her. If anything, it had sharpened her, because grief made her cling harder to the rules that had structured her life. She received Elizabeth with formal courtesy and a gaze that measured. There was sympathy there, but it was the sympathy of a woman who believed sympathy should not interfere with duty. Queen Mary told Elizabeth in careful phrases that the burden was heavy, but the institution would endure. Elizabeth answered, equally careful, that it would endure because they would endure. It sounded like agreement. It was also a warning. Queen Mary might be the guardian of tradition. Elizabeth was now the guardian of the living king. The first great test arrived immediately, before their private shock had even cooled. The new king had to address the nation. A broadcast. The word alone made Albert's face tense. His stomach tightened. He had made progress with lion or log, but progress is not the same as ease. And now every syllable would be heard by millions. There would be no polite room of sympathetic listeners. There would be no ability to pretend the stammer was only nerves. The king's voice would be judged as the voice of stability itself. Albert tried to practice and stumbled. He clenched his jaw. He grew angry with himself. Anger made it worse. The old shame returned, familiar and poisonous. Elizabeth watched him with a calm that was not natural kindness. It was chosen kindness. Chosen kindness takes effort. She sent for Log. There were courtiers who disliked this. An Australian commoner close to the king was not the image they preferred. Elizabeth did not care what they preferred. She cared what worked. Low arrived and treated the king as he had always treated him, not as a fragile symbol, but as a man with a difficult problem and a job that had to be done. He set up breathing. He drilled rhythms. He insisted on practice. He spoke to the king without flattery. If anyone in the palace disliked it, they learned quickly that Elizabeth did not enjoy hearing complaints about the man who was keeping her husband upright. The day of the broadcast came. Albert sat in a room with microphones that looked like small black animals waiting. Papers were placed in front of him. His hands trembled. He tried to steady them. His face had the pale concentration of a man about to step into cold water. Elizabeth stood nearby, just out of sight of the microphone, close enough that he could feel her presence, far enough that he could not cling to it as an excuse. She watched him with a face that was calm and warm and unyielding all at once. Albert began. The first words were slow. Then he found the rhythm Log had taught him. He forced air through his lungs the way a swimmer forces it through waves. He spoke. He faltered. He recovered. He spoke again. When it ended, the room remained still for a moment, like a church after a prayer. Albert's shoulders sagged, his eyes closed, briefly, as if he had been holding himself together with thread and had just been allowed to rest. Elizabeth stepped forward and touched his arm. She did not gush. She did not praise him as if he were a child. She said simply that he had done it. Her voice carried relief, but also the quiet meaning beneath it. "You can do what you fear." Albert looked at her with gratitude, so raw it almost hurt to witness. He nodded. Once, then he inhaled, and for a moment he looked like a man who might survive his own life. The public responded with something close to tenderness. People knew the king struggled. Many had heard him stumble in earlier speeches. Now they heard him push through. They heard effort. Effort is something ordinary people understand. A flawless king can feel distant. A king who fights through a weakness can feel human. Elizabeth understood that, and she used it not cynically, not like a cold calculation, but like a woman who knows survival depends on public feeling. She allowed the image of the devoted couple to form, the anxious, dutiful king and the steady, smiling queen beside him. It made the country want to protect them. And a country that wants to protect its monarch is far less likely to pull the monarchy apart when politics grow sharp. Behind the scenes, another fight began, and it was the kind of fight that would never be called a fight in polite society. Edward was no longer king, but he still wanted the treatment of a king. He wanted money, he wanted status, he wanted his woman to be recognized fully. He was given the title Duke of Windsor, a gesture meant to grant him dignity, without returning him to power. He accepted it with the air of a man accepting a consolation prize. Then he insisted that Wallis, once she was divorced and married to him, should be treated as royal with full style, dank rank. This was the matter that would harden Elizabeth's reputation into something far uglier than difficult. The question of whether Wallis would receive the style Her Royal Highness was discussed in careful phrases that pretended it was about protocol rather than pain. Protocol can be a wonderful mask. It allows people to be cruel while sounding reasonable. Elizabeth's stance was simple. Wallis would not be allowed that style. Some would say later that Elizabeth did it out of spite. Some would say she did it to punish Wallis. Some would say she did it to punish Edward. The truth, as always, was messier. Elizabeth despised what Edward had done because it had harmed her husband and threatened her children. She also believed that granting Wallis full royal status would send a message that the institution rewarded the very behavior that had nearly broken it. A monarchy survives by illusion, and one of its most important illusions is that duty matters. If Wallis became fully royal, duty would look optional. Elizabeth would not allow that it was also personal. Elizabeth had been forced into a role she dreaded because Edward wanted a woman. Now Edward wanted that woman to have the same public glory Elizabeth would have gladly avoided. It felt like theft with a smile. She did not rage about it. She did not throw scenes. She did what she always did. She held the line. Ministers agreed partly from principle, partly from fear of public reaction. Queen Mary agreed with even sharper feeling because Queen Mary regarded Wallis as the living evidence of Edward's failure. Albert was torn. He hated conflict. He hated hurting his brother. He also hated the idea of rewarding him. Elizabeth did not soften for Albert's discomfort. She reminded him gently but firmly that the crown must not look weak. She reminded him that the country was watching. She reminded him that if Edward and Wallis were given too much comfort, they might continue to meddle, to pull at the monarchy like children testing a loose thread. Albert listened and nodded, and in that nod was a loss of the idea that family affection could protect them from consequences. When Edward married Wallis in France in June 1937, it was a small ceremony that felt by design like a performance of exile. Few of his relatives attended. Edward wanted them there. Elizabeth refused. She would not stand in a church and smile at the union that had forced her husband into the crown. If anyone called it bitterness, Elizabeth did not care. Bitterness can be appropriate when someone has poured poison into your life. Edward wrote letters that were alternately pleading and indignant. He said the family was cruel. He said they were punishing him for love. He said they were ungrateful. He said with a kind of dramatic self-pity that he had given up everything. Elizabeth read some of these letters and felt her mouth tighten. Given up everything, as if he had not gained the woman he claimed he could not live without, as if his title, his money, his comfort were nothing, as if the true victims were not the people now forced to carry his abandoned duty. Elizabeth did not reply herself. She let the king reply when necessary, and the replies were correct, restrained, and cold. Elizabeth understood something important about Edward. He loved emotional scenes. Emotional scenes made him feel alive. Denying him emotional scenes was a kind of punishment. It was also safer. As coronation planning began, the palace faced a difficult truth. The coronation had already been planned for Edward. Dates had been set. Guests had been prepared. The machinery of ceremony had been in motion. Now it had to be reassembled around Albert, a man who hated attention, and Elizabeth, a woman who understood attention too well to pretend it did not have teeth. Some suggested delaying to give the new king time. Elizabeth rejected the idea quickly. Delay would look uncertain. Uncertainty invites trouble. The country needed to see the crown settled firmly, placed on the correct head with the full weight of tradition. The message had to be clear. The monarchy had survived the scandal. The monarchy would continue. Privately, Elizabeth knew that ceremony would demand something from Albert that he had always feared. Not only a speech, but an entire day of being watched, judged, expected to radiate calm. It was cruel in a way the palace never admitted. Yet Elizabeth also knew that if Albert could endure it, it would bind the country to him emotionally. People would admire the effort. They would feel protective. They would begin to believe in him. She pushed him steadily through preparation, more practice with log, more rehearsals, more exposure to formal language. She insisted he learn the order of events until it felt like muscle memory. She did not allow him to say he could not. She allowed him to say he was frightened. Then she told him to keep going anyway. Their daughters became part of the visible story. Princess Elizabeth was now heir presumptive, the first in line. She was still a child, but the palace bigger to look at her differently. Her lessons became more serious. Her daily life was adjusted subtly, not as punishment, but as preparation. Elizabeth, the mother, took charge of this too. She wanted her daughter to grow into duty without being crushed by it. Princess Margaret remained more carefree, but even she could sense the shift. Children sense the way adults become careful around them. They sense when their parents carry weight. Margaret became, at times, more clingy, at other times, more mischievous, as if trying to pull laughter out of rooms that had grown too solemn. Elizabeth loved that about her second daughter, even when it exhausted her. Laughter in their household was not merely entertainment, it was relief. It was a reminder they were still human. The coronation in May 1937 was a spectacle of tradition designed to make the country feel ancient and safe. Westminster Abbey filled with the glitter of uniforms and jewels, the heavy scent of flowers and old stone. The music rose and fell like a tide. The crowds outside cheered as if sound could rebuild certainty. Albert, now George V, VI, walked through the ceremony with a face that looked calm to strangers and felt like struggle to those who loved him. Elizabeth walked beside him with the composed grace that made it look as if she had been born to it. In a way, she had. She had been raised in the world that trained women to hold themselves as if their bodies belonged to ceremony. But now the ceremony belonged to her too, and she knew the cost. When the crown was placed on George's head, Elizabeth felt something sharp inside her chest, a flicker of grief and anger and pride all tangled together. Grief for the life they had lost, anger at Edward, pride in Albert for enduring, fear for what the future might demand now that they had accepted it. She did not let any of this show. Her face remained serene. The crowd needed serenity. The cameras needed serenity. The country needed to believe. Its king and queen was steady. Afterward, the public adored her even more. She was described as charming, maternal, reassuring. Her smile became a symbol. People began to cling to her image, especially women who recognized something in her composure. A woman holding a household together while men made dangerous decisions. A woman making a public life look graceful while doing difficult work behind the scenes. Elizabeth understood the power of that image, and she cultivated it carefully. She visited hospitals. She met mothers. She spoke to children. She did not behave like a distant figure. She behaved like a familiar one, the kind you might imagine as a friend if your life were grander. Yet inside the palace, the atmosphere remained tense. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor existed like a shadow. Edward wanted attention, he wanted money, he wanted influence. He also, for all his claims of love, seemed to miss the stage as much as he missed anything else. He wrote letters to the king that alternated between affectionate brotherhood and thinly veiled demands. Elizabeth read these letters when necessary and felt her patience stretched thin. There were days she wanted to tear the paper. She did not. She encouraged George to keep responses brief, correct, and distant. Every ounce of emotional energy spent on Edward was an ounce stolen from the work ahead, work that was beginning to darken across the Channel. Europe was shifting. Speeches were being made that sounded less like politics and more like threats. Borders felt less stable. Governments eyed each other with suspicion. Britain, still carrying scars from the last war, wanted desperately to believe peace could be preserved by agreements and polite meetings. George met with ministers, often learning the heavy, dull details of state that his brother had ignored. He took the work seriously, which made him tired, which made his stammer more dangerous. Elizabeth watched him and adjusted their life accordingly. She insisted on rest when possible. She insisted on routines that calmed his nervous system. She insisted on small moments of family life that reminded him he was not only a king, he was a father. She also insisted on something that surprised some courtiers. She insisted that the royal family be visible in times of political tension, not as politicians, but as symbols of steadiness. A king who hides invites fear. A king who shows up invites courage. As the late 1930s unfolded and the idea of another war stopped being unthinkable and started being discussable, Elizabeth's public role sharpened. She became more than the smiling queen. She became the face of reassurance, especially for women watching their sons grow into military age again, women who remembered the last war's telegrams, women who did not want to bury another generation. Elizabeth did not speak to them as if she were above them. She spoke as a woman who had lost a brother in France. She did not mention Fergus often. She did not need to. The knowledge sat behind her eyes. People could feel it, even if they did not know its name. In private, her feelings out Edward hardened into something close to contempt, not always hot contempt, often colder. She could be cordial when required. She could be correct. But she did not forgive easily, and she did not forget. She regarded Edward's abdication not as a romantic sacrifice, but as an abandonment of duty that had endangered her husband and her children. Those who wanted Elizabeth to be purely sweet were disappointed. Those who wanted her to be purely calculating were also wrong. She was neither a saint nor a villain. She was a woman with a fierce sense of loyalty to her own and a fierce sense of the rules that held their world together. That loyalty could look like warmth. It could also look like steel. There was a moment during a discussion about whether the Windsor should be allowed back into certain social circles in Britain when a senior figure suggested that perhaps time had softened feelings. Elizabeth listened and replied in a voice as light as a teacup that time had not changed the facts. Then she smiled, as if she had said something pleasant. The suggestion died quietly in the room as if it had never been spoken. People began to tell stories about her then, not the public stories of kindness, but the private stories of sharpness. They said she could freeze a person out with a glance. They said she could ruin a courtier's prospects with a sentence, delivered softly. They said she could be generous and then without warning, relentless. They said she was in blunt terms a nasty piece of work. The people who said it most loudly were often the people who wanted something from her and had discovered she could not be moved. George relied on her more each year. He relied on her not only emotionally but politically. though the word political would have offended many. She listened to ministers with careful attention. She remembered details. She offered George her sense of people who could be trusted, who wanted attention, who wanted influence, who was driven by principle, and who by vanity. George valued her judgment because he valued stability, and Elizabeth was stability made human. Their daughters grew in the shadow of all this. Princess Elizabeth, now clearly the future, began to understand duty with a seriousness that sometimes made adults uncomfortable. It is unsettling to realize a child is paying attention. She watched her parents. She watched the way her mother smiled when tired. She watched the way her father worked through fear. She absorbed it. Margaret Younger sensed the tension and reacted by seeking joy. She sang, she teased, she performed little plays. Elizabeth encouraged it because joy was not frivolous. It was resilience. As Europe moved closer to war, the King and Queen planned a journey that was meant to strengthen bonds across the Atlantic, a tour that would show unity, that would show stability, that would show the world. Britain was not alone. Elizabeth agreed to it because she understood the purpose. She also dreaded it because she knew what travel demanded of George. Endless speeches, endless crowds, endless pressure. Yet she did not allow dread to become delay. Delay was the language of fear, and she had decided long ago that fear would not run her household. One night, as plans advanced and ministers spoke in measured tones about alliances and danger, Elizabeth sat alone for a moment in a quiet room of the palace. The lamps cast a soft light. Outside the city, hummed, she thought of Glamis and the way stone holds cold. She thought of the telegram about Fergus. She thought of Edward's careless smile. She thought of George at the microphone, fighting his voice into clarity. She had once refused a prince because she feared becoming a symbol. Now she was a symbol, and she had discovered something ironic. Being a symbol did not remove her humanity. It simply demanded she hide it when it was inconvenient. She stood, smoothed her skirt, and went to find her husband. George was in his study, reading papers with the grim concentration of a man who had learned the world could collapse if you treat it lightly. He looked up when she entered. His eyes were tired. He smiled at her anyway because her presence still offered him something like peace. Elizabeth crossed the room and sat beside him. She did not speak immediately. She simply took his hand. He squeezed once, grateful. Then he asked quietly whether she thought the country would face war again. Elizabeth looked at the papers, at the official language that tried to make danger sound like administration. She looked at her husband's face, at the lines that had deepened since the abdication. She thought of her daughters upstairs, one a future queen, one still young, enough to believe in fairy tales. She answered in the only way she could. She said she did not know, but she said if war came they would not run from it. She said the monarchy would not hide behind curtains while ordinary people suffered. She said they would stand where the country could see them. George held her gaze. He nodded slowly as if taking in both the promise and the burden. Outside, London continued to glow. Inside the palace, a king and queen prepared themselves for a future that was beginning to feel less like a rumor and more like a footstep approaching the door. When war finally arrived, it did not announce itself with trumpets. It arrived the way dread arrives, with a date on a calendar and a tightening in the chest. On September 3rd, 1939, George went to the microphone again. The words were heavier than any he had spoken before, because they could not be taken back once spoken. Elizabeth stood nearby, as she always did now, close enough to steady him, far enough to let him own the moment. He spoke of Germany's actions, of Britain's response, of duty and resolve. He spoke slowly, carefully, forcing each sentence into the air as if he were building a bridge out of breath. When it was over, he looked at Elizabeth with a silent question. Had he done it? Had he sounded like a king? Had he sounded like a country that would not crumble? Elizabeth touched his arm and nodded. Then she did something he had come to rely on. She turned immediately to the work that followed. Motion, messages to send, schedules to adjust, people to see. If the nation was about to be frightened, it needed a routine to cling to. She understood that fear spreads fastest in empty hours. There were voices sensible on paper, urging the royal family to leave London. A king and queen were too valuable to risk, they said. The heir, young Elizabeth, should certainly go somewhere. Safer, perhaps Canada. It was framed as protection, and it was. It was also political. If the monarch fled, it would look like the country had already lost. Elizabeth refused. She refused with the same calm certainty she had shown as a teenager. When grief walked into her house, and she rang for tea. The children would not go without her, she said. She would not go without the king, she said. The king would not leave his people, she said. There were no dramatic flourishes. It was stated like a rule of nature. Courtiers tried again, softer, this time suggesting that mothers must think of their children. Elizabeth replied that she was thinking of her children and that she would not raise them to believe danger was something other people faced while they were whisked away to comfort. It was not a sentimental decision. It was a strategic one, and it was also deeply personal. She had grown up with the memory of war. She had watched her mother receive telegrams. She had lost a brother. She knew what it meant for families to be asked to endure. She would not allow the crown to look like a privileged spectator. So they stayed. They did not stay recklessly. They moved the children to Windsor more often, a safer place than central London, but close enough that the family could still be seen. They split their time, and they made sure the public knew it. The message was simple. We are here. We are not hiding. You are not alone. When the bombing began in earnest, London changed. Nights became a different world, a world of darkness and sirens, and people huddled in underground stations with blankets and tea and a grim sort of companionship. Fires lit the sky. Streets that had been familiar became craters and smoke. Buckingham Palace was hit. It was not once, it was more than once, and the sound of the explosions shook the great rooms that had once felt untouchable. Glass shattered. Dust fell from ceilings. The palace staff reacted with panic and training, rushing, shouting, then remembering to lower their voices. Elizabeth was inside during one of the attacks. She felt the building tremble. She smelled smoke. For a brief moment, the world became the same world it had been at Glamis. When the telegram arrived, a sudden jolt of reality, and then the question, what do we do now? She did what she always did. She moved. She checked on the staff. She checked on the damage, and she checked on George. She kept her face calm. Later she was reported to have said with a bluntness that startled people that she was glad the palace had been bombed, because now they could look the East End in the face. Some found that remark cold, some found it brave. The truth was that it was both. Elizabeth understood that symbols matter most when they bleed. A palace with broken windows was not just a palace. It was a message to Londoners, sleeping under staircases, that even royalty could not buy immunity. It leveled the story just enough to create solidarity. And solidarity was the currency of survival. She and George began visiting bombed neighborhoods with a determination that frightened their security staff. They walked through rubble. They spoke to women whose faces were gray with exhaustion and soot. They spoke to children with wide eyes and scraped knees. Elizabeth did not approach as a distant queen offering pity. She approached like a woman offering recognition. She could look at her family standing in the ruins of a home and say a few words that sounded ordinary and meant everything. People remembered her shoes covered in dust. They remembered her voice steady. They remembered her smile, the same smile they had seen at parades, now used in the middle of wreckage. They did not remember every word, but they remembered how they felt. They felt less abandoned. This was where Elizabeth became, for many, the heart of the war story. George was respected. George was dutiful. George was the king who would not leave. Elizabeth was the one who made people feel that endurance could be humane. She was also quietly the one who pushed the palace to keep showing up, even when everyone wanted to retreat. Some in government found her useful. Winston Churchill, who would become Prime Minister in 1940, understood theatrical courage. He understood that morale is not just a mood, it is an engine. He liked Elizabeth's resolve. He liked her humor. He also liked that she could stiffen a room without making it seem like a lecture. Elizabeth liked Churchill too, though liking in her world did not mean obedience. She admired his bulldog refusal to surrender. She also understood that he could be difficult, dramatic, and occasionally careless with other people's nerves. When she needed something, she could be charming with him and also firm. Churchill, who enjoyed strong personalities, often responded well to that. Two people can clash and still value one another if they share a sense of the stakes. There were also those who disliked her influence. Some courtiers murmured that the Queen had too much say. Some politicians worried she would meddle. Elizabeth did not help her own reputation by occasionally speaking of people she disliked with a bluntness that would have been shocking from a man and merely described as sharp from a woman. If a minister was foolish, she could make it clear. If a courtier was lazy, she could make it clear. If someone tried to steer George toward timidity, she could make it clear. Her methods were rarely loud. They were personal. An invitation withheld, a conversation cut short, a look that froze a smile, a remark delivered gently, as if offering advice that left the target feeling as if they had been turned out into the cold. The same woman who could hold a grieving widow's hand and make her feel less alone could also make a powerful man feel unwelcome in his own palace. That contradiction was the source of her power and the reason so many people privately feared her. During the war, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor hovered like unfinished business. Edward wanted a role. He wanted importance. He wanted above all to feel the tea. He was still central. There were rumors, dangerous ones, about his attitude toward Germany, about his private conversations, about his resentments. The government, in its cautious way, handled it by moving him far from the center. He was sent as governor to the Bahamas. It sounded like honor. It was also containment. Elizabeth did not complain about this arrangement. She did not need to. It suited her perfectly. Edward and Wallace, far away, could not poison London with their presence. They could not undermine George with whispered comparisons. They could not stir up sympathy that might reopen the wound of abdication. Some would later say Elizabeth was cruel to Edward, that she never forgave him. That was true. She did not forgive him. Forgiveness did not come naturally to her. When the injury threatened her, family, and the institution she now felt responsible for, she could be cordial when required. She could be correct, but she did not open doors for people who had pushed her husband into a crown and then demanded gratitude for it. George's health suffered as the war dragged on. Stress has a way of marking a body. He smoked, he worked, he carried the weight of decisions that arrived in stacks of paper and in casualty lists. The stammer stayed mostly controlled, but the effort behind control never stopped. Elizabeth could see fatigue settling into him like winter. She did not allow him to retreat into despair. She arranged his days. She insisted on rest when she could extract it. She insisted on small moments of family life, even in wartime, even when the palace felt like a bunker of schedules. She understood what George needed, and she gave it to him with the same blend of tenderness and command that had held him together since the abdication. Their daughters grew in this wartime world, one learning early what it meant to be watched, the other learning early what it meant to make people laugh when fear is thick in the air. Princess Elizabeth, serious and conscientious, wanted to contribute. As she got older, she trained and served in a women's auxiliary unit, learning practical skills. It was symbolic, yes, it also mattered to her. Elizabeth the mother was proud and also anxious, because mothers do not stop being mothers just because their children wear uniforms. When victory finally came in 1945, London erupted in relief that looked like joy and felt like grief underneath. People danced, people sang, people wept. The royal family appeared on the balcony, and the crowd roared up at them as if sound could fill the holes left by war. Elizabeth stood beside George, smiling, waving, composed. Inside she felt something private and sharp. Fergus again. The memory of the telegram, the knowledge that war always takes more than it returns. Peace did not mean ease. The country was exhausted. The empire was changing. Rationing continued. People expected the monarchy to adjust to prove it still belonged in a modern world. Elizabeth understood this better than many courtiers did. She had always understood that the monarchy survives not by being perfect, but by being emotionally useful. She also understood that emotional usefulness requires discipline. It requires a willingness to be criticized and still show up. It requires a willingness to accept that your private life is not fully yours. George continued working, but his health worsened. In the late 1940s, he began to look thinner, more drawn. There were surgeries, quiet medical decisions, handled with discretion. The palace kept its face steady. Elizabeth kept her face steadier. In 1951, George's doctors became more worried. His lungs were damaged. There was a cancer diagnosis that the palace did not speak of openly. He had an operation that removed part of a lung. He tried to recover, tried to return to duty, tried to pretend strength could be summoned by will. Elizabeth watched him with the helpless fury of a woman who had spent her life managing everything, and now faces the one thing that cannot be managed. She did not crumble. She did not allow herself theatrics. She sat with him. She held conversations that were ordinary and precious. She kept their household calm. She made sure the staff behaved with respect and silence when needed. Their elder daughter, now a young woman, was stepping into more responsibility. She and her husband, Philip, traveled on behalf of the crown. Elizabeth, the mother, watched her daughter leave for a tour in early 1952 with a mother's pride and a mother's dread. She kissed her daughter goodbye and kept her face composed. George died on February 6, 1952 at Sandringham in the quiet of the night, the way many exhausted men die, finally allowing their bodies to stop fighting. Elizabeth was told in the morning. The messenger's voice shook. The words were simple. The king is dead. For a moment the palace was only silence. Then Elizabeth did what she had done as a girl. She moved. She asked for her daughters to be contacted. She asked for arrangements. She asked for black. She asked for calm. Then, alone for a moment, she sat down and felt the lost land. This was not only the death of her husband, it was the end of the partnership that had been her life's work. The man she had built a public world around. The man whose courage she had insisted on. The man she had loved in the stubborn, practical way she loved. Grief rose in her throat. She swallowed it. She had to, because now her daughter was queen. When Elizabeth the younger returned, she returned as Elizabeth II. The public looked at the young queen with hope and curiosity. Behind her, in the shadows of mourning, stood the older Elizabeth, now called the Queen Mother, a title that sounded gentle and cozy, and did not begin to describe her. She was widowed at 51. She could have withdrawn. She could have become a figure of quiet sorrow. She did not. She chose a role. She would be the anchor. She would be the living link to the war and to the king who had endured it. She would support her daughter's reign, and she would protect her daughter from the palace, from politics, and from the exhausting demands of being a young woman on a throne. Support again sounded gentle, sometimes it was. Sometimes it looked like pressure behind a smile. There were immediate family dramas that tested her. Princess Margaret, lively, charming, and vulnerable in her way, fell in love with Peter Townsend, a war hero and a divorced man. The romance captured the public imagination. It also triggered the same old problems of church and tradition that had nearly destroyed the monarchy in Edward's time. Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, had lived through abdication. She had lived through the public's hunger for romance and its sudden cruelty when romance defied rules. She had no desire to watch another crisis unfold, especially not on her daughter's young shoulders. Margaret wanted to marry Townsend. The palace hesitated. The government weighed in. The church frowned. The newspapers circled. The Queen Mother, caught between love for her child and fear for the institution, became in Margaret's eyes an obstacle. Margaret could be dramatic. Margaret could be wounded. Margaret could also be stubborn like her mother. There were arguments behind closed doors, arguments the public never heard in full. The Queen Mother could be soothing one moment and immovable the next. She could say she understood Margaret's heart, then insist Margaret must think of duty. She could speak of sacrifice, of how love must sometimes bend to reality. Margaret heard it as cruelty. In the end, Margaret did not marry Townsend. She made a public statement that sounded composed and private decisions that were not composed at all. The Queen Mother watched her younger daughter's heartbreak and carried the guilt of it like a hidden bruise. She did not show it in public. She was too practiced for that. This was another way she became feared and misunderstood. She could enforce a painful decision without looking pained, because looking pained would have invited criticism, and criticism would have weakened the institution. People called it coldness. Some even called it nastiness. Margaret for a time called it betrayal, and yet the Queen Mother remained close to Margaret, defending her when others judged her, supporting her when loneliness pressed. She could wound and protect with the same hands. It was not saintly, it was complicated. As the decades moved on, she remained a public figure of surprising energy. She traveled, she attended events, she became associated with ceremonies so thoroughly that she seemed to embody it. She had a talent for making small towns feel important, for making charities feel noticed, for making veterans feel remembered. She also enjoyed the pleasures of her station. She liked good food. She liked a drink, often a familiar one, and she liked it at the hours she preferred. She liked racing. She liked social evenings. She was not ashamed of enjoying luxury. She believed luxury was part of the Crown's theatre, and she believed theatre mattered. The bills mattered too. Over time, it became an open secret in certain circles that the Queen Mother's household could run expensive. She maintained residences, staff, gardens, wardrobes. She had tastes shaped by a world that assumed large houses would always be large houses. Britain by then was not always eager to fund that assumption. The royal finances were adjusted quietly, as such things always are, through allowances, arrangements, and a careful avoidance of public detail. Those who loved her called it tradition. Those who disliked her called it entitlement. She would have called it simply how things were done, and she had never wasted much time apologizing for how things were done when she believed they served the monarchy. Her relationship with her daughter, the Queen, was affectionate and full of shared discipline. They were similar women in different generations. Both believed in duty. Both believed in composure. Both could be stubborn as stone. They could also disagree sharply in private. The Queen Mother's influence over her daughter was strongest in the early years, when the young Queen needed reassurance, advice, and a model for how to survive. Over time, the Queen grew into her own authority, and the Queen Mother shifted gracefully in public, not always gracefully in private. It is hard for a woman who has been central to step back. She remained, however, the one person who could speak to the Queen with bluntness and still be loved for it. She could criticize a decision softly. She could warn of a person's motives. She could urge caution about friendships, about marriages, about anything that threatened to turn private drama into public crisis. When new figures entered the royal family, the Queen Mother's instincts awakened. She had been shaped by the old court, and she did not trust easily. She was polite, charming, but watchful. In 1981, when Charles married Diana, the nation fell into fairy tale fever. The Queen Mother watched the spectacle with experienced eyes. She understood what the public wanted. She also understood what the public would do if the fairy tale cracked. She had lived through abdication, through war, through the slow grind of duty. She did not believe in fairy tales as a method of survival. Diana, young and emotional and painfully visible, did not fit neatly into the Queen Mother's idea of royal behavior. The Queen Mother was not cruel to her in public. She could be gracious. She could even be kind, but she did not indulge drama, and Diana's life became a whirlwind of emotion and attention that the Queen Mother found dangerous. When the marriage failed and the public mood turned volatile, the Queen Mother's first instinct was not to soothe feelings, it was to protect the institution. It always was. That protection could feel harsh to those caught inside it. Then came 1997, and the death of Diana, and the shock that made Britain feel as if it had been struck physically. The public's grief was enormous, and it was not quiet grief. It was anger and accusation and flowers piling up like drifts against palace gates. The royal family was slow at first, partly from tradition, partly from shock, partly from the old belief that privacy should be guarded and emotion should not be performed. The public did not want old beliefs, it wanted visible feeling. Inside those tense days, the Queen Mother's influence mattered. She had lived through the war. She had learned how quickly morale can collapse if people feel abandoned. She understood the danger of silence. She urged the Queen to show herself, to return, to be seen, to acknowledge the public's grief without being swallowed by it. She understood that dignity and warmth could exist together, but only if you chose them deliberately. The Queen did appear. The funeral took place. The crisis eased, though the scar remained. The Queen Mother watched the crowds and thought perhaps how different this was from her own era when the public was expected to accept what it was given. Now the public demanded, and it demanded loudly. She adapted as she always had, but adaptation does not erase old habits. Her instinct remained control. In her later years, stories about her sharpened and multiplied. People who had served in palaces wrote memoirs. Journalists searched for angles. Biographers sifted through letters, through diaries, through the unkind remarks people had once whispered and now felt safe printing. Some stories painted her as saintly, the nation's grandmother, the woman who smiled through bombs. Other stories painted her as hard, domineering, dismissive, capable of astonishing chill behind that warm, public face. People told tales of her loyalty and also of her grudges. There were family secrets too, the sort that aristocratic families had long treated as private tragedies, and the modern world treated as public scandal. Relatives whose lives had been hidden away in institutions, not out of individual cruelty so much as out of an era's fear of shame, became part of the wider story. The Queen Mother was criticized for the family's silence, for the instinct to hide what did not fit the polished image. Some of the criticism was fair, some was cruel in its certainty. The truth was that her generation had been trained to treat certain hardships as things you endured quietly, and she had carried that training into a century that increasingly demanded openness. She was not always kind in how she handled discomfort. She was, however, consistent. She protected the image as if the image were a living thing that would die without her. Those who called her a nasty piece of work were often people who had discovered that her warmth had borders. She could be charming to the public and chilly to a person she thought disloyal. She could be generous and then cut someone off without explanation. She could remember a slight for decades because memory was part of her armor. She also could be fiercely, almost extravagantly loyal to those she loved. Staff, members who served her well, could find their lives quietly improved. Families in hardship could receive assistance without publicity. A widow could receive a note that made her feel less alone. Veterans could be remembered by name. People liked to sort famous women into simple categories: angel or witch, warm or cold. The Queen Mother resisted that kind of sorting because she contained too many opposites. She was at different moments the same woman who rang for tea when her brothers died, the same woman who held a line against a fallen king, the same woman who walked through rubble and made people feel brave, the same woman who could freeze a room with a glance. As old age settled into her bones, she did not retreat from public life as much as many expected. She continued appearing, smiling, waving, attending. There was a stubbornness in her, the stubbornness of a woman who had survived being forced into history and had decided history would not push her quietly into a corner. Her friends dwindled as time does its work. Her husband was long gone. Many of the figures she had battled were gone too. Her daughter was still queen, still carrying duty, still living the life the queen mother had once dreaded for herself and then defended with her whole being. Princess Margaret, her lively, wounded, beloved younger child, died in February 2002 after years of illness. The queen mother, already fragile, received the news with the same quiet stillness she had shown at every loss. Those close to her could see it wounded her deeply. She had always been a protective mother, even when she had enforced painful decisions. Losing Margaret was like losing the bright, mischievous part of her own household. In the weeks that followed, she declined. The body finally began to do what no will can prevent. On March 30th, 2002, she died at Royal Lodge in Windsor at the age of 101. The funeral drew crowds, as funerals do, for symbols. People lined streets. They left flowers. They spoke of her as the nation's grandmother, the woman who had smiled through war. They remembered her hats, her charm, her visits, her presence. Others remembered something else. They remembered her hard edges. They remembered her grudges. They remembered the way she could be ruthless behind closed doors. They remembered how power can wear a smile. Both memories were true in the quiet after her death, when the ceremonies were finished and the flowers began to wilt. The story of Elizabeth Bose's lion settled into its full shape. A girl raised in castles and drawing rooms, learning early that emotion must be managed. A young woman refusing a prince because she feared becoming a symbol, then choosing him anyway, and discovering the symbol would claim her regardless. A wife pushing a reluctant man into courage, then holding a nation's morale together while bombs fell. A queen mother guarding the institution with a protectiveness so fierce it could bruise the people nearest her. If she was warm like a fire you could gather around. If she was cold like stone that does not yield. Everyone who worked near her understood it. Everyone who married into the family eventually learned it. Everyone who tried to manipulate her discovered that the smile was not an invitation, it was a warning. There is a line people like to repeat about her, that she was difficult, that she was formidable, that she was not always kind. Those words can sound like condemnation. They can also sound like description of what was required of her. She lived through a century that tore at the Monarchy from every angle. Scandal, war, poverty, changing morals, furious newspapers. The crown survived in part because she refused to let it become flimsy. Kindness alone would not have done that. Charm alone would not have done that. Being liked alone would not have done that. Somewhere in the early memory of her life, and in that room at Glamis, with weak tea light and a telegram that turned a family's air cold, a 15-year-old, Elizabeth had moved through shock and made order out of chaos. Tea she had asked for, because tea meant the world had not ended. Not yet. It was a small act of control in the face of something uncontrollable. She spent the rest of her life repeating that act on a grander scale. When war came, she rang for courage. When scandal came, she rang for discipline. When grief came, she rang for composure. Sometimes the ringing sounded like kindness, sometimes it sounded like steel, and if people called her nasty, perhaps it was because they had wanted her to be only one thing, only sweet, only comforting, only harmless. She was never harmless. She had understood too early what the world does to the unprepared, and she had decided with a smile and a steady hand that it would not do it to her family, not while she was still standing in the room.